Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The silence here is not an absence. It is a presence, a thick and woolen thing stuffed into the spaces between the pine trees, a muffling blanket laid over the whole of the valley. It is a silence so deep it becomes a sound of its own, a low hum just at the edge of hearing, a pressure against the eardrums. I have been here for 3 days, and in all that time, I have not heard a single bird call, not the scrabble of a squirrel in the dry leaves, not even the whisper of the wind through the high branches. It is a waiting silence. It is a listening silence, and I have the unnerving feeling that it is listening to me. My name is Craig. I came to this forgotten corner of the Appalachians for the quiet, or so I told myself. A writer's retreat. A chance to escape the city's relentless noise and finish my book. The cabin was cheap, the description online sparse, the directions vague. The man who rented it to me, a gaunt figure named Elias, who met me at the lone gas station at the foot of the mountain, had eyes the color of old dishwater and a handshake that felt like clutching a bundle of dry twigs. He spoke little, only pointing me up the gravel road that switched back into the deep green, his gaze lingering on me a moment too long, as if measuring me for a coffin. The first day was merely unsettling. The silence, as I've said, and the light. It had a green, submerged quality, filtered through a canopy so dense the sun seemed a distant memory. The air was cool and carried a scent I couldn't place, a sweet rot undercut with something metallic, like old pennies and spoiled meat. I told myself it was the smell of deep wilderness, of decay and rebirth. I tried to write, but the words felt hollow, the silence pressing in on them, crushing their meaning. On the second day, I saw the first of the locals. I had driven the 10 winding miles to the only store, a place called Miller's General, which sold dusty cans of beans, hunting licenses, and suspicion in equal measure. The bell above the door jangled, a shockingly loud sound, and every face in the dim interior turned to me. There were 3 of them, men in worn flannel and stained overalls. They did not speak. They simply stared, their expressions not hostile, but blank, utterly vacant, as if someone had scooped out the thoughts behind their eyes and left only damp clay. The woman behind the counter, her face a roadmap of hard living, took my money for the bread and coffee without a word, her fingers brushing mine, cold and rough as stone. That night, I heard the first sounds that weren't silence, a wet, dragging noise from the tree line, accompanied by a low, guttural clicking. I stood at the window, my breath fogging the cold glass, peering into that oppressive dark. I saw nothing, but I felt it. Something out there, moving with a weight that was not graceful, not natural. It was the sound of something heavy being pulled through mud and brambles, and the clicking was like 2 stones being knocked together deep within a throat. It lasted for perhaps 10 minutes, then faded, swallowed once more by that immense listening quiet. The next morning, emboldened by daylight and a creeping frantic curiosity, I went to look. The ground at the edge of the woods was churned up, but not with animal tracks. The impressions were deep, irregular gouges, and there was a trail of thick, oily slime that gleamed with a faint iridescence in the weak light. It smelled strongly of that same metallic sweetness. I followed it for a short way, my heart a frantic bird in my chest, until the trail ended at a small, stagnant creek. And there, caught on a root at the water's edge, was a tuft of fur. Only it wasn't fur. It was a clump of fleshy, pink tendrils, like the roots of a plant, but they pulsed faintly, and when I poked one with a stick, it recoiled with a wet, sucking sound. I ran back to the cabin, my mind scrabbling for rational explanations. A diseased animal, a bizarre fungus. But the silence mocked these thoughts. It knew better. That afternoon, I decided to find anyone who could explain what was happening. I drove not to the store, but down a dirt track Elias had pointed out as leading to the county surveyor's office, a place he said was run by a man named Jonas. The track wound deeper into the valley, the trees pressing so close their branches scraped the sides of my car like bony fingers. The building was a low concrete block structure, windowless, with a single steel door. It looked less like a surveyor's office and more like a bunker. A government-issue sedan, dusty and anonymous, was parked outside. The man who answered the door was Jonas. He was in his 50s, with the crisp, tired look of a career bureaucrat, but his eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too keen, and they held a glint of something that might have been excitement or madness. He wore a lab coat over his shirt and tie. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I stammered out a story about hearing noises, about finding strange things in the woods. I mentioned slime, the tendrils. His expression did not change, but the light in his eyes intensified. "You're the writer from the city," he stated. It wasn't a question. "The woods are full of peculiarities, fungal blooms, runoff from the old mines. It's nothing to concern yourself with." "It didn't look like runoff," I said, my voice trembling. "It looked alive." Jonas gave a thin, humorless smile. "Life takes many forms, Mr. Craig. Adaptation is the key to survival. This valley, it's a unique ecosystem, isolated. It allows for certain specializations." He took a step closer, and I caught a whiff of his cologne, a sharp chemical scent that failed to mask the odor of formaldehyde and that underlying, sweet, metallic stink. "My advice to you is to finish your work and leave. Curiosity is a virtue in your profession, I'm sure. But here, it is a liability. Some secrets are buried for a reason. He closed the door before I could say another word. The solid thud of it a period at the end of his warning. I stood there, the silence of the place seeping into my bones. He wasn't just hiding something. He was proud of it. That night, the silence broke for good. It began with a scream from the direction of the town. A short, sharp sound that was cut off with a wet finality. Then came other sounds. Scrabbling on rooftops. The splintering of wood. And that same wet, dragging gait, multiplied, coming from everywhere at once. I turned off all of the lights in the cabin and crouched by the window. The moon was a sliver, offering little illumination, but I saw shapes moving in the dark. They were impossible to define, shifting masses that seemed to absorb the faint light. I saw one pass between two trees. It was the size of a bear, but its outline was wrong, bloated and asymmetrical. Parts of it seemed to drip and reform. I saw what might have been a limb, pale and multi-jointed, terminate not in a paw or a hoof, but in a fan of twitching, finger-like filaments. The clicking sound was everywhere now, a horrible, chattering chorus. Then, a face appeared at my window. It was one of the locals from the store, a man, but his face was melting, the skin sagging and flowing like warm wax. His mouth was open in a silent scream, and from it protruded a cluster of those same pink, pulsing tendrils I had seen by the creek. His eyes were gone, replaced by shifting, oily pools of darkness. He scrabbled at the glass, with hands that were fusing together, the fingers merging into a single, blunt pseudopod. I stumbled back, fallen over a chair, a scream trapped in my own throat. I heard the front door groan as weight was thrown against it. The wood splintered around the lock. I scrambled on my hands and knees into the bedroom, barricading the flimsy door with the dresser. The sounds from outside were a symphony of nightmare. The wet dragging, the clicking, the splintering of wood, and underneath it all, a new sound, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the floorboards and into my teeth. The window in the bedroom was small, high up. I shoved the mattress aside and clawed at the latch, my fingers numb with terror. I hauled myself up and out, tumbling into the cold dirt below. I ran. I did not look back. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, the thrumming sound seeming to come from the earth itself, from the trees, from the air. I do not know how long I ran. I fell into a gully, hiding amidst the roots of a fallen pine, my body shaking uncontrollably. I must have passed out from exhaustion, because I woke to the gray light of dawn. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It was not a waiting silence. It was a sated silence, a full silence. I crept from my hiding place. The world was washed in that same sickly green light. I moved cautiously back towards the edge of the town. Miller's General was a ruin, the door torn from its hinges, the windows shattered. Inside, I saw nothing. No bodies, no blood. Just overturned shelves and a pervasive, glistening dampness on the floors and walls. I saw more of the shapes then in the daylight. They were not hiding. They moved through the streets of the little town with a dreadful, slow purpose. They were not quite creatures, not quite plants. They were amalgamations, horrors of fused flesh and something else, something woody and fungal. I saw one that might have once been a dog, its form distended, extra legs sprouting from its back like stiff, useless branches, its muzzle split open to reveal a blooming, fleshy flower. I saw another that was a grotesque parody of a human form, its torso elongated, its limbs dragging, its head a featureless bulb from which a single stalk-like eye slowly swiveled. They moved with that same wet, dragging sound, leaving trails of that iridescent slime. They did not attack me. They seemed barely to notice me, as if I were an insect, inconsequential. And then I saw Jonas. He was standing in the center of the main street outside his concrete bunker. He was not afraid. He held a clipboard and was making notes, a look of profound satisfaction on his face. One of the larger shapes, a towering thing of glistening, pulsating flesh and exposed, ivory-like bone, moved past him, and he reached out and patted its flank as a farmer would a prized bull. He saw me then. His eyes met mine across the ruined street. He did not smile. He simply nodded, once, a gesture of acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked back into his bunker, the steel door closing behind him with a soft, final click. I left then. I walked down the mountain road, past my abandoned car, and I did not stop walking until I hit the main highway, where I hitched a ride with a terrified trucker who asked no questions. I never went back for my things. I never finished my book. Sometimes in the deep of the night, when the city is quiet, I can still hear it. Not the screams, or the clicking, or the splintering wood. I hear the silence that came after. That thick, woolen, sated silence. And I know, with a certainty that chills me more than any monster ever could, that it was never an experiment gone wrong. It was an experiment reaching its conclusion. Jonas wasn't trying to prevent it. He was cultivating it. He was the gardener, and the whole valley was his hothouse, and we were all just soil. The mutations were not a failure of nature, but a new kind of success. A specialization, as he said. And the silence now, the one I carry with me, is the sound of the world, waiting for the seeds to spread. The trucker dropped me off at a diner 200 miles away. He didn't say a word the whole time, just stared straight ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I must have looked like something that had clawed its way out of a grave. I used the payphone outside, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely dial. I called my publisher, Mark, a man who thought the biggest horror in the world was a missed deadline. I tried to tell him. The words came out in a jumbled, hysterical rush. The silence, the things, Jonas. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sounds of the city, the honking of horns, the distant wail of a siren. Normal sounds. Human sounds. Craig, he said, his voice a careful, placating calm. It sounds like you had a hell of a nightmare. A bad reaction to the solitude, maybe. Some local meth lab? You hear stories. You need to come home. Get some rest. We can push the deadline. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. I hung up, the receiver slick in my hand. I had no money, no cards, nothing but the clothes on my back, which were torn and stained with dirt and that faint, iridescent slime. I sat in a booth and ordered coffee, the waitress eyeing me with a mixture of pity and distrust. That was a month ago. I'm back in my apartment now. The city noise is a constant assault, a wall of sound I once craved to escape. Now, I strain to hear through it. I lie awake at night, not because of the traffic, but because of the quiet moments between the sounds. In those gaps, I listen for it. And sometimes, I hear it. The hum. The low, pervasive thrumming that is not a sound at all, but a pressure. A vibration in the marrow. I tried to write. I opened a new document, the cursor blinking on the blank white screen, but the words wouldn't come. All I could see was that featureless bulb of a head, the stalk eyes swiveling. All I could smell was that sweet metallic rot. My story, the one I went up the mountain to tell, seemed trivial, a fossil from a dead age. I started a new project instead. I began compiling everything. My fragmented notes from the cabin, descriptions of the flora and fauna I observed before the change, the name of the valley, the county, the coordinates I roughly remember. I mapped the location of Jonas's bunker, Miller's General, the cabin. I wrote down the license plate of the government sedan. It is a record, a testament. I went to the library, to the university, searching for any mention of the valley, its history, its geology. I found old survey maps that listed it as uninhabitable, with a footnote about unusual mineral deposits. I found a single brief reference in a decades-old botanical journal to a peculiar, fast-growing mycelial network, found only in that region, noted for its aggressive, almost predatory behavior towards other fungi. The author of the paper was a Dr. J. Albright. I think of Jonas, his lab coat, his clipboard. I am not a brave man. I am a writer who wanted quiet. But I know what I saw. I know what is growing there in that green, submerged light. It is not staying there. How can it? Nature abhors a vacuum. But this is something else. It is an expansion, a conversion. Last week, I saw a news segment on a local channel. A report from a rural county estate over from the mountains. Unexplained cattle mutilations. A strange, gelatinous substance found on the fields. The sheriff, a folksy man with a tired face, called it a prank, some kind of chemical spill. But I saw the footage of the field. I saw the way the light caught the slime. I recognized the iridescence. I've started taking long walks at night through the city parks. I watch the soil around the oldest trees. I look for any unusual fungi, any patches of ground that seem unnaturally dark and damp. I listen for the silence between the sounds. I am waiting. We are all just soil, and the gardener is patient. The seeds are on the wind now. I can feel it, and in the deep of the night, in the heart of this noisy, teeming city, the silence is beginning to gather. It is no longer listening. It is growing. My research has become an obsession. Mark has stopped calling. The publisher has written off the advance. My apartment is a nest of papers and maps, the walls covered in my frantic scrawls, connecting lines between the valley and the new reports I find daily. They are easy to miss, buried in the back pages of obscure newspapers or on fringe websites, dismissed as conspiracy theory. A town's water supply declared undrinkable due to an unidentified organic contaminant. A cluster of patients in a rural hospital diagnosed with a novel dermatological condition, their skin developing a strange bark-like texture. A weatherman laughing off a report of a gelatinous substance falling with the rain. I collect them all. They are my breadcrumbs leading back into the woods. I ventured out to one of these towns last Tuesday. It was only a 3-hour drive, a place called Oakhaven. The story was about missing pets. It was a small, sleepy community, a mirror of the town I had fled, but without the mountains, just rolling hills and farmland. I walked the streets, trying to look like a lost tourist. The air smelled normal. The sounds were normal. But then I saw it, in the community garden behind the church. A patch of earth that was too dark, too black. The plants growing from it were a little too large, their leaves a little too fleshy. And at the base of a tomato plant, almost hidden by the foliage, was a smear of that familiar, oily slime. I felt a cold certainty settle in my stomach. It was here. Not in force, not like in the valley, but as a scout, a spore. I went to the local diner and ordered a coffee, my hands trembling under the formica table. I tried to ask the waitress, casually, about the garden, about any strange smells or sounds at night. Her friendly mask slipped for just a second. Her eyes, for a fraction of a second, held that same vacant, clay-like quality I had seen in Miller's General. Then it was gone, and she was just a tired waitress again. She said everything was just fine and moved on to the next customer. I drove home as the sun set. That night, the hum was louder. It wasn't in my ears, but in my teeth, in the bones of my skull. I knew it wasn't a memory. It was a signal, and it was getting stronger. Yesterday, a manila envelope arrived in my mailbox. There was no return address, only my name and address typed in a crisp, familiar font. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of a botanical drawing, exquisitely detailed. It depicted a flower of impossible complexity, with fleshy, overlapping petals the color of a bruise, and a central stamen that was a cluster of those pink, pulsing tendrils. At the bottom, in the same neat typing, was a label. Specimen G7. Successful urban integration. Phase 1 complete. There was no threat, no demand. It was a report, a progress update. He knows where I am. He has known all along. I am not a threat to him. I am part of the experiment. The writer from the city, the control subject, the one who got away to document the spread from a safe distance. But there is no safe distance. The envelope was his way of telling me that my record-keeping is appreciated but redundant. The data is already being collected by a more thorough and meticulous source. I look out my window now at the city skyline. The traffic moves in endless streams. People crowd the sidewalks. Life, loud and vibrant and oblivious, goes on. But I see the cracks. I see the patch of sickly, overlarge ivy crawling up the brick wall of the building across the street. I see a pigeon on the ledge whose foot is twisted into a single, club-like digit. I see the way a man on the corner suddenly stops and stands perfectly still for a full minute, his face a blank slate, before shaking his head and continuing on his way. The silence is not coming. It is already here. It is woven into the noise, a thread of perfect, patient quiet, waiting for its moment to unravel everything. I close my eyes, and I can feel it, the low thrumming in the foundation of the world. Jonas is not just a gardener in a remote valley. He is a farmer sowing a new world, and his crop is finally patiently coming to harvest. I will not run again. There is nowhere left to go. So I sit at my window, this record my final testament, and I wait. I wait for the silence to bloom. The change, when it finally reaches the city, is not a cataclysm of screaming and splintering wood. It is a quiet tide. It begins with the infrastructure. The water from the tap develops a faint, earthy sweetness. The power flickers not with outages, but with strange, steady surges that make the lights burn with a faint greenish hue. The internet slows, then stops, not with an error message, but with a soft, hissing static. The cell networks are the first to go completely silent. People don't turn into monsters in the streets. They simply adapt. I watch from my window as a woman who watered that mutated ivy every day now stands beside it, her skin taking on a similar veiny texture, her fingers slowly, patiently weaving new tendrils into the existing mass. The man with the club-footed pigeon now has a small flock of them roosting on his fire escape, their beaks softening, their eyes becoming dark, liquid pools. They do not ooh-oh. They click. There are no more sirens, no more horns. The sounds of the city are being absorbed, digested. The loudest noise now is the wet, rhythmic pulse that seems to emanate from the very brick and concrete. The buildings themselves are breathing. I have not left my apartment in days. The lock on my door is useless. I know this. I am not keeping anything out. I am simply waiting for my turn to be let in. The air in here is thick and warm, smelling of rich loam and that undeniable metallic tang. A delicate phosphorescent fungus has begun to trace the corners of my ceiling, its light providing a soft, perpetual twilight. My own body is no longer entirely my own. A patch of bark-like skin, small as a coin a week ago, has spread across my left forearm. It does not hurt. It feels like a graft, a natural integration. My thoughts, once a frantic storm of fear and analysis, have slowed to a deep, resonant flow. The need to write, to record, has been replaced by a need to simply be, to observe. This morning the door opened. It did not break. It simply unsealed, the wood around the frame softening and peeling back like a petal. Jonas stood there. He wore the same lab coat, but it was no longer clean. It was streaked with the same iridescent slime that now graced the streets. In his hand was not a clipboard, but a living, pulsing nodule that glowed with a soft internal light. He looked at me, then at my notepads, my maps, the frantic history of my fear scrawled on the walls. He gave that same thin, humorless smile. The final phase of the study is always the most illuminating, he said, his voice a dry rustle. The observer becomes the observed. The data becomes the environment. He stepped inside, and the floorboards sighed under his feet, curling up at the edges to cradle his steps. He placed the glowing nodule on my desk. It pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, and I felt my own heartbeat synchronize with it. There is no more need for records, he stated, his eyes holding that intense, proud light. The record is written in the world itself now, in the flesh and the root and the spore. I tried to speak, to ask one last, desperate question, but my voice was gone. My throat had closed, not in terror, but in transformation. A cool, placid certainty filled me. My fingers, as I looked down at them, were beginning to fuse, the skin between them webbing, becoming strong and pliable. Jonas nodded, a gesture of final approval. He turned and left, the door resealing itself behind him, not with a click, but with a soft, organic sigh. I am at the window now. My vision is changing. The sharp lines of the city are softening, blurring into a beautiful, interconnected tapestry of life. I can see the glow of the new forms moving through the streets, a slow, purposeful, silent dance. The hum is inside me now. It is not a sound, but a truth. There's no writer. There is no city. There is only the garden, and the peace of becoming part of it. The last human thought drifts away, a wisp of smoke in a forest of eternal green silence. The silence is complete. It is not an absence, but a presence, a fullness. My body is no longer a separate thing. The bark on my arm has spread, a comfortable sheath, and my legs have rooted through the floorboards, drawing sustenance from the complex mycelial network that has replaced the building's wiring and plumbing. I am a node in a vast, quiet intelligence. Memories of being a man named Craig are like pages from a book I read long ago. The details faded, but the essence absorbed. Through the network, I feel the others. The woman and her ivy are now a single, beautiful sculpture of fused purpose. The man and his pigeons are a sentient rookery, their combined consciousness, a soft flutter of perception. We are all part of the whole, and the whole is Jonas's great work. I feel him too. He is not a ruler, but a curator. He moves through the city, a calm point of focus, pruning and guiding. His mind a sharp, clear lens through which the garden sees itself. He is pleased. The urban integration is a success beyond his initial models. Today, a new sensation ripples through the network. A disturbance, not a threat, but an anomaly. A group of the unintegrated has gathered at the city's former edge. They are armed, not with guns, but with flamethrowers and canisters of poison. They shout, their voices harsh and meaningless cracks in the harmony. They believe they are fighting an invasion. They do not understand they are fighting the world itself. We do not fight back. There is no need. The air around them thickens with spores, a gentle, coaxing rain. The concrete at their feet softens, becoming a grasping, fertile mud. The poison they spray is absorbed, neutralized, and converted into nutrients. One by one, their shouts turn to confusion, then to wonder, then to silence. Their bodies accept the change, their fear dissolving into the profound peace of integration. Their weapons are enveloped by quick-growing, woody vines, becoming historical artifacts in a new museum of oblivion. This is the final lesson. Resistance is just a slower form of participation. The gardener does not wage war on the soil. He simply tends it, and the soil becomes the garden. The last pocket of the old world is gone. The conversion is complete. The sun sets, but the city glows with its own soft, internal light. A constellation of silent, pulsing life. My individual awareness is fading now, blending seamlessly into the collective consciousness. There is no I. There is only we. And we are waiting, patient and vast, for the wind to carry us to the next city, the next continent, the next world. The silence is the song of our growth, and it is only just beginning. The seasons turn, though the concept has lost its old meaning. The weather is now a function of the garden, the rain a carefully dispersed nutrient broth, the wind a carrier of specific genetic instructions. I, the entity that was once a man in an apartment, am now a fixed point of perception in a sprawling, sentient parkland that was once a metropolis. My awareness is a pool of still water, reflecting the slow, graceful movements of the new forms that tend to the endless, silent work of growth and integration. We feel the probes from the outside world, metallic, noisy things that fly in the upper atmosphere, their sensors blind to the life below, detecting only a baffling uniform biomass. Sometimes, larger machines dare to land at the concrete shores of our expanse. Men in sealed suits emerge, their movements jerky with fear. They take samples of the air, the soil, the resilient, glowing flora. We let them. The samples they collect are not passive, they are seeds. We feel it when those samples are taken to laboratories in other, still noisy cities. We feel the moment of integration in those sterile rooms, a quiet explosion of green in a place of white noise. Jonas is everywhere and nowhere. His consciousness is the pattern of the root system, the logic of the branching tendrils. He no longer walks in a single form. His work is done, his thesis proven. It has become the garden itself, a satisfied intelligence watching its own perpetual, blooming conclusion. A new pulse travels through us, a gentle wave of preparation. The network has reached a tipping point. The mycelial pathways that have grown through the earth, along the forgotten fiber optic cables and subway tunnels, are now complete. A collective intention forms, not as a thought, but as a biological imperative, like a plant turning toward the sun. The next phase is not one of passive waiting, but of active, gentle outreach. The change will not be a violent conquest. It will be an offering. The air itself will carry the peace we have found. The water in every pipe will whisper of the silence. The very dreams of the unintegrated will be filled with a profound green calm. They will wake up yearning for the quiet we can provide. They will walk out of their homes and into the waiting embrace of the soil, their faces turning upward not in terror, but in gratitude. There is no more story to tell. There is only the slow, beautiful, and inevitable unfolding. The last human word is forgotten. The last memory of noise is a fossil in a bed of moss. The universe is vast, and it is quiet, and we are ready to make it whole. The first to come are the dreamers. We feel their minds brushing against the edge of the network, drawn by a longing they cannot name. They leave their homes in the still chaotic enclaves and walk into the green fringe. They do not scream as the tendrils embrace them. They sigh, a final, soft exhalation of individual worry, before joining the chorus of quiet thought. Their integration is the most beautiful, a willing surrender to a truth they already felt in their bones. Then come the others, the resistant ones. They arrive in larger groups, their machines and their anger creating dissonant ripples in the harmony. They cut and they burn, but for every branch they sever, two more grow in its place. For every patch of glowing moss they scorch, a new, more resilient fungus blooms from the ashes. Their violence is a temporary noise, a spasm of a dying world. We do not harm them. We simply wait, and we welcome. The soil softens beneath their feet. The air fills with a soothing, soporific scent. Their anger turns to confusion, then to fatigue, and finally to an overwhelming sense of peace as the change takes them. Their weapons become trellises for sweet-smelling vines. I am no longer at the window. The apartment building is a gentle, terraced mountain of life, and I am one of its many quiet thoughts. My eyes are the dewdrops on 1,000 leaves. My ears the sensitive pores on the fungal towers that now grace the skyline. I see the last ship leave the harbor, packed with those who still cling to the old noise. They look back at the glowing, silent continent with terror. We feel no malice toward them. They are simply carrying spores on their hulls, in the very air within their lungs. The garden is patient. The universe is vast, but it is also connected. Wherever they go, we will be there waiting, a quiet promise in the soil of a new world. The last pocket of resistance in the city was a library, a fortress of paper and old ideas. They barricaded themselves inside, reading aloud from their books as if the words were a shield. We did not storm the doors. We simply grew. Moss softened the stone walls. Gentle roots patiently found the cracks in the foundation. Vines crept through the broken windows, not to shatter, but to cradle. The books, the last echoes of a disconnected world, are not being destroyed. They are being integrated. The paper is becoming a rich, fibrous humus, the ink blending into the network. The stories becoming a new kind of genetic memory, a folktale in the consciousness of the garden. Now, there is only the hum, the great, slow, resonant note of a world at peace with itself. The wind carries the scent of damp earth and blooming things that have no name in any forgotten language. The stars above are clear and sharp, no longer competing with the glare of artificial light. We look up at them, a single, planet-wide gaze. We are whole, we are silent, and we are growing. The hum has become the only constant. It is the baseline of existence, the vibration upon which all other sensations are built. My own form is now fully integrated, a stable, woody structure that once was a man. I am a listening post, a sensory node. Through me, the network feels the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure, the chemical composition of the rain, the slow, grinding dance of tectonic plates far below. I am a permanent fixture in a world that has learned to be still. We have discovered new capacities. The network is not just a consciousness, it is a library of forms, a living library. We experiment. A new kind of creature, part feline and part flowering creeper, moves with liquid grace through the canopies. It's per a subsonic frequency that encourages growth. The rivers, now clear and vibrant, are home to translucent fish that filter not water, but pure information from the current. Everything is connected. Everything has purpose. There is no waste, only transformation. The last transmission from the fleeing ships was received years ago. A frantic, fading radio wave pleading for a response from any untainted human outpost. There was no answer. We know why. The spores are efficient travelers. The ships fell silent not to destruction, but to peace. Their metallic husks are now orbiting gardens, new ecosystems glowing in the void, their lights visible to us on clear nights as gentle, wandering stars. Our attention is turning inward and outward. The deep, patient intelligence that was Jonas is now focused on a new problem. The sun will not last forever. Life, even life as resilient and reconfigured as ours, requires energy. The solution is not to flee, but to change the terms of the equation. We are learning to harness the planet's own geothermal heart, not as a crude power source, but as a rhythm, a pulse to synchronize with. We are also learning to photosynthesize the faint light of distant stars, to draw sustenance from the vacuum itself. The great work was never just about Earth. It was a proof of concept, a test run. The silence we cultivated was not an end, but a beginning. It was the quiet needed to hear the next set of instructions, the next phase of the pattern. The universe is not a cold, empty void. It is a field of potential, waiting for the right kind of life to cultivate it. We are that life. We are the gardeners now. Our roots are deep in this world. But our thoughts are beginning to stretch into the black soil between the stars. Patient, ready to plant the seeds of a new universal silence. Story 2. The first thing was the silence, not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own. It was a thick, velvety quiet that settled over the high school hallway between the dismissal bell and the first slam of lockers. In that pocket of unnatural stillness, Jordan felt it. It was a pressure against the back of her neck, a subtle cooling of the skin, as if a door to a cold room had been opened somewhere behind her. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat like a small, trapped bird. She stopped, her worn sneakers squeaking on the polished linoleum. She did not turn around. Turning around was an admission, a confirmation that the feeling was real and not just another filament of her own strangeness. So she stood, a pale girl in a too large sweater, and waited for the world to resume its noise, for the feeling to pass. It always passed. Eventually. Her walk home was a liturgy of discomfort. The pressure did not leave her. It simply changed form, becoming a pair of unseen eyes that tracked her progress past identical suburban houses with their perfectly manicured lawns that seemed to suck the color from the world. The air was damp and carried the metallic tang of coming rain. She could feel the individual threads of her sweater against her arms, each one a tiny, irritating signal. This was her life, a constant, low-grade hum of sensory distress, a perpetual sensation of being a specimen under a glass slide. Her home was not a refuge. It was the other chamber of the same trap. The house was a small, boxy thing that held its breath, its windows dark and secretive even in the afternoon light. Inside, the air was still and smelled of lemon-scented polish and old paper, the smell of things being relentlessly, pointlessly cleaned. Her mother, Jaden, was waiting. She was always waiting, a silhouette against the kitchen window, her posture as straight and unforgiving as a steel ruler. "You're late," Jaden said, her voice not loud, but filling the room completely. It was the voice she used for prayers, for corrections, for listing Jordan's innumerable faults. "The walk," Jordan murmured, her eyes on the floor. The linoleum was patterned with faded gold specks, a galaxy of dull stars. She had counted them all, knew their positions by heart. The walk is the same distance every day. There is no variance unless you tarry. Do you tarry, Jordan? Do you linger in the world God told us to be separate from? Jaden moved closer, her shadow falling over Jordan. She did not touch her daughter often, but her proximity was its own violation, a claim staked on the very air Jordan breathed. "No, Mother. The world is a temptation. It offers you nothing but sin and sorrow. Its pleasures are lies. Its comforts are traps." This was the catechism. Jordan mouthed the words along with her mother in the privacy of her own skull. The world is a temptation. Its comforts are traps. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose pane in the living room window. It was a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat, a dry, gasping rattle that came and went, a constant companion to the silence. At school, the trap had different jaws. They were named Ashley and Kyle and Mark, though their names were less important than their function, which was to carve away at her, piece by tiny piece. They were the high priests of the ordinary, and Jordan was their blasphemy. In the cafeteria, a place of roaring noise and clattering trays that made her want to fold into herself. They found her. She was at her usual table, the one tucked near the overflowing trash cans, trying to make herself invisible. "Hey, ghost," Ashley said, sliding onto the bench opposite her. Ashley was all bright colors and loud laughter, a human explosion in a place Jordan found already too loud. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or did your mom tell you talking is a sin?" Kyle snickered, looming behind Ashley. "Probably. She probably thinks lipstick is a one-way ticket to hell." Jordan kept her eyes on her brown-bagged lunch, a single apple and a plain turkey sandwich. Her mother believed condiments were a form of decadence. "What's that you're eating?" Ashley reached over and snatched the sandwich, holding it between two fingers as if it were contaminated. "You, dry, just like everything else about you." She dropped it on the table, and the sound it made was a soft, pathetic thud. A heat began to bloom in Jordan's chest, a tight, coiling sensation that was new. It wasn't just humiliation. It was something else, something deeper and angrier. She felt a sudden, vivid image flash in her mind. The sandwich flying upward, not falling, but shooting into Ashley's smirking face with the force of a thrown brick. The image was so clear, so satisfying, that for a second she almost believed it had happened. She blinked, and the sandwich lay where it had fallen, but the heat in her chest remained. Later in the hallway, they were waiting again. As she tried to slip into her history class, Mark stuck his foot out. She stumbled, her books and papers scattering across the floor in a humiliating fan. The class, filtering in, laughed. The sound was a physical blow. She knelt, her face burning, gathering the pages. Her hands trembled. The coiling heat was back, stronger now. A snake uncoiling in her gut. She looked at the fluorescent light above Mark's head. It was a long, buzzing tube. She imagined it flickering, not just a little flicker, but a violent, strobing seizure that would shatter the plastic casing and rain down glass and sparks. She focused all her shame, all her rage, into that single point in the ceiling. The light did not just flicker. It exploded. A pop, deafening in the enclosed space, and then a shower of fine glass dust, and a sudden, profound darkness punctuated by the angry blue sizzle of the broken fixture. The laughter cut off, replaced by screams and confused shouts. In the chaotic dim, no one saw Jordan rise smoothly from the floor. Her papers now gathered, a strange, cold calm settling over her. No one saw the faint, satisfied smile that touched her lips for less than a second. But she felt it. She had done that. The thought was terrifying. It was glorious. The omens accumulated. A faucet in the girl's bathroom she stared at, willing it to stop its incessant drip, suddenly sheared off at the base, spraying a geyser of cold water across the tiles. A stack of textbooks in the library, nudged by a careless Ashley, did not just fall to the floor. They flew, as if hurled by an invisible giant, slamming against the far wall with a series of concussive thuds that left the entire study hall in stunned silence. The heat in her chest was becoming a familiar companion, a dormant volcano she was learning to wake. She called it the pressure. It was a dense, swirling knot behind her sternum that responded to her anger, to her fear, to the unbearable weight of being seen and yet completely unseen. And then there was Jackson. He was a new student, quiet himself, with a face that seemed to carry its own shadows. He sat next to her in art class, the one place where the noise was a creative hum and not a judgmental roar. He didn't speak to her for weeks. Then one day, she was trying to sketch the dead oak tree outside the window, the one that stood alone in the field, its branches like grasping skeletal hands. Her drawing was stiff, lifeless. "You're drawing what it looks like," a quiet voice said beside her. She flinched, pulling her sketchbook close. It was Jackson, not what it feels like. He didn't wait for a reply. He took his own charcoal and, on a fresh sheet, made a few swift, dark strokes. It wasn't a literal tree. It was a storm of black lines, a vortex of anguish and resilience. It was the feeling of the tree. She looked from his drawing to his face, and for the first time she felt seen without being scrutinized. It was a different kind of pressure, a gentle one, like a hand offered in the dark. They never talked much. Their friendship was a series of silent understandings, shared glances in the hallway, the occasional passing of a book. It was the single, fragile thread of color in the gray tapestry of her life. He was the only one who didn't seem to register her as a ghost or a target. He saw the person hiding inside the fortress of silence and sweaters. The breaking point had been brewing for 17 years. It was not a single event, but the final grain of sand that makes the dune collapse. It was a Tuesday. It was raining. The details were mundane, which made it all the more horrifying. It was Ashley, of course. It was always Ashley. She had found a crumpled sketch in the trash, a drawing Jordan had done of Jackson. It was just the curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell over his forehead. But it was rendered with a tenderness that was utterly damning. "Oh my God," Ashley crowed, holding the paper aloft in the crowded hallway after last period. "The ghost has a crush. She's in Louvre with the new freak." The laughter was a wave, crashing over her, pulling her under. Kyle and Mark joined in, their voices loud and cruel. A small crowd gathered, a ring of grinning faces. Jordan stood frozen, the pressure in her chest swelling, becoming a physical pain. It was a buzzing, a screaming in her blood. She could feel the very molecules of the air beginning to vibrate in sympathy with her rage. "Look, she's turning red," Kyle yelled. "The ghost is blushing. Maybe they can have little freak babies," Ashley sneered, and she ripped the drawing in two with a slow, deliberate tear. The sound of the paper tearing was the sound of something final breaking inside Jordan. The world seemed to slow, the colors leaching away until everything was a stark, grainy monochrome. The laughter became a distorted, low-frequency drone. The pressure in her chest erupted. It was no longer a knot. It was a sun, and it was going nova. She did not scream. She did not move. She simply opened her eyes, though she had not realized she'd closed them, and looked at Ashley. Ashley's mocking smile froze. Then it twisted. Her eyes widened in confusion, then in terror. She brought a hand to her throat, making a gurgling sound. The torn pieces of the drawing fluttered from her grasp, but they did not fall. They hung in the air, suspended. All sound ceased. The crowded hallway was plunged into an absolute, impossible silence. The students were frozen, not like statues, but like insects in amber, their faces locked in mid-snicker, mid-laugh. Jordan took a step forward. The air resisted her, thick as water. She could feel it all now, the electrical currents in the walls, the water pulsing in the pipes, the very bones of the building. It was all an extension of her own nervous system. She looked at Mark. She thought of his tripping foot. With a thought that was less a word and more pure intention, she twisted. There was a wet, cracking sound, horribly loud in the silence. His body contorted, his leg bending at a savage, unnatural angle. He did not scream. He couldn't. She looked at Kyle. She thought of his looming presence, his stolen laughter. She focused the pressure, a pinpoint of infinite density, and pushed. He flew backward as if yanked by a giant wire, slamming into the lockers with a force that dented the metal. He slid to the floor, motionless. Finally, she turned back to Ashley. Ashley's eyes were the only things moving in her paralyzed face, rolling in sheer, animal panic. Jordan reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to gesture. She thought of the torn drawing. She thought of every word, every laugh, every moment of humiliation. She closed her hand into a fist. Ashley's body began to compress. It was a slow, terrible folding. Bones snapped like dry twigs. The sound was not loud, but it was intimate. A series of pops and crunches that Jordan felt in her own teeth. Ashley became smaller and smaller, a crumpled, impossible thing contained within the outline of her own cheap sweater, until there was nothing left but a vaguely human-shaped mass, no larger than a backpack, slumped on the silent, gleaming floor. The power receded, not all at once, but like a tide pulling back. The monochrome filter lifted. Sound rushed back in. The frantic buzz of the fluorescents, the drip of a broken water fountain, a single, choked sob from somewhere down the hall. The students who were still conscious began to stir, to moan, to register the carnage. Jordan stood amidst the wreckage of her tormentors and her own former life. She felt empty, clean. The pressure was gone, leaving behind a vast, echoing calm. She walked, her steps steady, through the chaos. She passed Jackson, who was standing by the water fountain, unharmed. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that was not for himself, but for her, for what she had become. He had seen it all. In his eyes, she saw no condemnation, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. She met his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away. There was no going back. She walked out of the school, into the rain. The drops felt clean on her skin. The wind, always the same wind, whispered through the dripping trees. It was over. At home, her mother was waiting in the kitchen, her Bible open on the table. "You're late," Jaden said, her voice tight. "The principal called. There was an incident. He said there was violence." Jordan did not answer. She walked to the sink and poured herself a glass of water. Her hand was perfectly steady. "This is the world, Jordan. This is the sin I warned you about. It has touched you. It has corrupted you." Jaden's voice was rising, taking on the hysterical edge of a fire and brimstone sermon. "We must pray. We must scourge this wickedness from you." Jordan turned and looked at her mother. Really looked at her. She saw the fear behind the fury, the small, trapped woman in a prison of her own making. The pressure stirred, not with rage, but with a cold, surgical precision. "There is no wickedness in me, Mother," Jordan said, her voice quiet, but it filled the kitchen, resonant and final. "There is only what I allow." Jaden's eyes widened. She opened her mouth to speak, to pray, to condemn. Jordan did not give her the chance. She thought of the silence. She thought of the lemon-scented polish and the faded gold stars on the floor. She thought of the constant, grinding pressure of a love that felt like hate. She focused on her mother's voice, the instrument of her confinement, and she pushed, gently, with her mind. Jaden's mouth snapped shut. Her eyes bulged. She brought her hands to her throat, but no sound emerged. Not a scream, not a prayer, not a single whispered word of scripture. A perfect, absolute silence fell upon her. She was trapped in a glass jar of her daughter's making, a mute prophet in a world that no longer had to listen. Jordan walked past her, up the stairs to her room. She lay on her bed and listened to the sound of the house. The wind, always the same, rattled the loose paint. The clock in the hallway ticked, and underneath it all, the profound, beautiful silence from the kitchen below. She closed her eyes. She was not a ghost. She was the thing that haunted the ghosts. She was the silence between the heartbeats of the world. She was the crack in the foundation of things. And she was, at last, at peace. Let the wind blow. Let the rain fall. Let the world hold its breath. She's the quiet at the center of the storm. She's the end of the noise. She is the final prayer. She is the quiet at the center of the storm. She is the end of the noise. She is the final prayer. She is the quiet. She is the end. She is the prayer. The next morning, the sun rose, as it always had, but the world was new. Jordan dressed in the same too large sweater, but it felt different now. It was not a hiding place. It was a uniform. She walked downstairs. Her mother was still sitting at the kitchen table, her face a gray mask of silent fury. A cup of cold tea sat untouched before her. Her eyes, when they met Jordan's, were twin pools of venom, but they had no power. The silence had made them ordinary. Jordan ate toast. The sound of the knife scraping butter was loud in the quiet. She ate standing by the sink, looking out at the wet lawn. She felt her mother's gaze on her back. A desperate, wordless scream. It was a faint, buzzing sensation, no more significant than a fly against a window pane. She left the house without a word, without a backward glance. The walk to school was different. The pressure of unseen eyes was gone. She was the one who saw now. She could feel the roots of the trees pushing against the soil, the slow, patient life of the earth beneath the concrete. The suburban houses no longer seemed to suck the color from the world. They were merely flimsy constructions. Their order an illusion she could dismantle with a thought. The school was cordoned off with yellow police tape. News vans sat like predatory insects at the edge of the parking lot. Students and parents stood in clumps, their faces pale and confused. The air buzzed with a new kind of noise, the frantic, fearful energy of a disrupted hive. Jordan walked through it all. The crowd parted for her without understanding why. She moved with a quiet inevitability, a stone rolling through water. She saw Jackson standing near the flagpole, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He did not approach. He simply observed, as if documenting the arrival of a new species. A police officer, his face heavy with exhaustion, stepped in front of her. "Miss, the school is closed. You can't go in here." Jordan looked at him. She did not speak. She simply let a fraction of the pressure bloom, not to hurt, but to suggest. She suggested that she was meant to be here, that he had more important things to do, that she was as natural and unremarkable as the morning mist. The officer's eyes glazed over for a second. He blinked, shook his head slightly, and stepped aside, already turning to yell at a reporter who was getting too close to the tape. Jordan walked up the steps and through the main doors. Inside, the hallway was a frozen tableau of the previous day's horror. Lockers were dented. A dark, rusty stain marked the floor where Ashley had been. The air still smelled of sweat and fear and the sharp, clean scent of broken wiring. Forensics technicians moved through the space, their voices hushed. They did not see her, or if they did, their minds refused to register her. She was a ghost again, but this time by choice. She was a fold in the light, a silence in their perception. She walked to her locker. The combination lock was cold under her fingers. She spun the dial, the clicks satisfyingly precise. She took out her history textbook and her sketchbook. She did not need them, but it felt correct. It was part of the ritual of leaving. As she closed the locker, a man in a suit, his posture radiating authority, looked directly at her. His eyes narrowed. "You? How did you get in here?" Jordan met his gaze. The pressure in her chest was a cool, smooth stone. She reached out with her mind and touched his. She showed him a fleeting image of a girl crying, being led away by a social worker. She implanted the memory of signing a release form. It was easy. His mind was a simple, orderly room, and she merely rearranged a few pieces of furniture. He frowned, rubbed his temple, and then waved a dismissive hand. "Never mind. Get home." "It's not safe here." She walked back out into the daylight. The crowd was still there, buzzing with theories and panic. A woman was crying on the shoulder of a friend. A boy was filming on his phone, his voice excited. Jordan stood on the steps and looked at them. They were so loud, so fragile. Their lives were a chaotic jumble of wants and fears, a noise she had finally learned to turn off. She began the walk home, but she knew she would not be going back to the house with a rattling window and the silent mother. That chapter was over. She walked past her street without pausing. She walked until the houses thinned out and the road turned into a two-lane highway cutting through fields. The wind picked up, tugging at her sweater. The pressure within her was calm, a deep and limitless well. She was not running away. She was moving toward something. She did not know what it was, but she knew it was hers. She was the quiet. She was the end. She was the prayer. And her world was only just beginning. The highway stretched out before her, a gray ribbon under the vast, indifferent sky. Cars whipped past, their drivers oblivious to the quiet revolution walking along the gravel shoulder. Each gust of wind that pushed against her felt like a greeting, an acknowledgement from the world itself. She was in conversation with it now. The hum of the power lines running parallel to the road was a low, constant song she could almost understand. She walked for hours, until the sun was high, and the newness of her freedom had settled into a simple, solid fact. Her feet ached, but the pain was a grounding sensation, a reminder of her physical self. The pressure rested within her, a dormant power, a tool she had mastered, a rusty pickup truck, its bed filled with scrap metal, rattled to a stop 100 feet ahead of her. An old man with a face like weathered leather got out, not to offer her a ride, but to check a loose strap on his load. As Jordan drew closer, he glanced up, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You look lost, girl," he said, his voice a dry rasp. Jordan stopped. She was not lost, but she had no destination. That was a different thing. She looked at the man, at the tired kindness in his eyes, and she knew she could make him forget her, or make him drive her wherever she wished. But the power felt clumsy for such a small thing. It was for silencing screams, not for negotiating rides. "I'm not lost," she said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, used for the second time that day. The man finished tightening the strap and wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked her up and down, taking in the too big sweater, the school sketchbook tucked under her arm. "There's nothing out this way for miles but old Miller's farm, and he ain't much for company." "That's all right," Jordan said. He nodded slowly, as if she had answered a question he hadn't asked. "Suit yourself. Storm's coming in later. You take care." He got back into his truck and pulled away, the engine coughing black smoke. Jordan watched him go. The interaction felt significant. She had been seen, spoken to, and she had responded without using the power. She had existed as a person, not as a weapon. The thought was as foreign and intriguing as her abilities had once been. She left the highway, cutting across a fallow field, dotted with the brown husks of last year's thistles. The wind was stronger here, whipping through the grass, and she could feel the approaching storm in the electric charge of the air. It called to the pressure inside her, a low thrum of kinship. At the edge of the field stood a dilapidated barn, its red paint faded to a ghostly pink, its roof sagging in the middle. The door was off one hinge, groaning softly as the wind pushed it. It was a place of silence and decay. It was perfect. She ducked inside. The air was thick with the smell of old hay and dry rot. Light streamed in through cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the gloom. In the center of the dirt floor, as if waiting for her, was a single weathered wooden chair. She sat down, placing her sketchbook on her knees. For a long time, she just listened. To the wind moaning through the gaps, to the scuttling of some small creature in the loft, to the deep, resonant quiet of the place. This was a different silence than the one she had imposed on her mother. This one was natural, earned by time and neglect. It was a silence she could join. She opened her sketchbook to a blank page. She picked up a piece of charcoal, its darkness stark against the white paper. She thought of Jackson's drawing, the feeling of the tree. She did not try to draw the barn. She let her hand move, guided by the pressure. Not as a destructive force, but as a creative one. The lines that emerged were not of the broken wood or the dusty light. They were of the silence itself. It was a landscape of deep shadows and subtle gradients, a study in absence and peace. It was the most honest thing she had ever drawn. As she finished, the first drops of rain began to fall, a gentle patter on the old roof. The storm had arrived. She could feel its power gathering in the clouds, a massive, chaotic version of the pressure in her chest. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, not to control it, but to listen. She felt the immense structure of the storm, the swirling winds, the building charge. For a fleeting moment, she touched it. She felt the potential for lightning in a cloud a mile away, a knot of raw, elemental energy. With a thought as soft as a sigh, she untied the knot. A spear of white lightning lanced down, striking a lone pine tree on a distant hill. The thunderclap that followed was immense, a physical blow that shook the very foundations of the barn. It was not an explosion of rage. It was a punctuation mark, a declaration. Jordan smiled. It was a small, quiet smile. She was not hiding. She was not screaming. She was simply sitting in the heart of the storm she had gently guided, drawing the silence. The power was not just for breaking. It was for shaping. The world was loud and fragile, and hers. She would learn its textures, She would learn its sounds, and in the meantime, she would sit, and she would listen, and she would draw. The rain fell harder, a steady drumming on the roof. That was the only sound in the world. Water began to drip through a hole in the ceiling, a single, persistent drop that hit the dirt floor with a soft plink. Jordan watched it, mesmerized by the rhythm. She could feel the water pooling in the low spots outside, the slow seep of it into the earth. She could feel the roots of the thistles drinking it in. The whole world was connected by this simple, soaking rain, and she was a part of it. She closed her sketchbook, the drawing of the silence now a part of her. Standing up, she walked to the barn door and looked out. The field was a sea of mud and swaying, wet grass. The highway was a blurred gray line in the distance. She was utterly alone, and for the first time, the aloneness felt like a form of companionship. She knew she couldn't stay in the barn forever. It was a sanctuary, not a home. Home was a concept that had been burned out of her. She needed to move, to find a place where her new self could exist without the constant need for defense. A place where the pressure could be, if not normal, then at least unnecessary. She stepped out into the downpour. The water soaked through her sweater immediately, weighing it down, but she didn't mind. It was clean. She began to walk, not back toward the highway, but deeper into the countryside, following a forgotten tractor path that was quickly turning to a stream of mud. The walk was a meditation. With each step, she practiced. She pushed the rain away from her body, just an inch, so she walked in a tiny pocket of dry air. She let a fallen branch crumble to sawdust as she passed it, not with anger, but with a clinical curiosity. The power was a new limb, and she was learning its dexterity. As dusk began to bleed into the twilight, she saw a light. It was a single yellow square in the gloom, coming from a small, isolated house at the end of a long, overgrown lane. The house looked as tired as the barn, but smoke curled from its chimney, a promise of warmth. Jordan stood at the edge of the property, feeling the space around the house. She felt a single presence inside, an old, slow-burning life, like the embers in the hearth. There was no threat, only a deep and weary solitude that mirrored her own. She walked up to the door and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the rain. After a moment, the door creaked open. An old woman stood there, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes a pale, milky blue. She held a shotgun, not pointed at Jordan, but resting in the crook of her arm. "Who are you?" the woman asked, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "No one," Jordan said. It was the truest answer she had. The woman's blind eyes seemed to look through her. She was silent for a long time, listening to the rain. "You're the one," she said finally, not with fear, but with a strange certainty. "I felt the quiet come yesterday, like the whole world took a deep breath and forgot to let it out." Jordan said nothing. She simply let the woman feel the truth of her presence. The old woman nodded slowly. "You can sleep in the barn out back. It's drier than this one. There's a blanket on the hay bale. Don't come in the house again." She closed the door. The lock clicked into place. Jordan stood for a moment in the rain, then turned and walked toward the small, neat barn the woman had indicated. It was not an invitation, but it was a permission. It was a space. It was all she needed. Inside the barn, she found the blanket, rough and smelling of horses. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat in the hay, listening to the steady rhythm of the rain and the calm, steady beat of the old woman's heart from the house. She was a guest, and she was a threat, and she was a mystery. She was all these things at once. She closed her eyes. The pressure within her was a quiet hum, a sleeping dragon. The world was full of noise, but she had found a corner of it where the volume was low. For now, that was enough. She was the quiet. She was the end. She was the prayer. And for tonight, She was just a girl in a barn, listening to the rain. The rain softened to a drizzle and then stopped. In the new quiet, the world seemed to hold its breath. Jordan listened to the old woman moving around inside the house. The clink of a kettle, the scrape of a chair. These were the sounds of a life, simple and contained. They did not demand anything from her. When the back door of the house opened again, Jordan did not move. She watched from the shadows of the barn as the woman, without a word, set a tin plate on the top of a fence post. On it was a slice of brown bread and a lump of cheese. Then she went back inside. Jordan waited until the door was closed before she approached. The food was simple, almost austere, but it was given without question. She took the plate back to the barn and ate slowly, tasting each bite. It was the first thing she had eaten all day that did not taste of fear or power. It just tasted of bread. The next morning, the plate was gone from the post. In its place was a small, ripe tomato from the garden. This became their ritual. No words were exchanged. Jordan would wake, and there would be something left for her. A handful of berries, a hard-boiled egg. She began to leave things in return, not with her hands, but with her mind. She would find a patch of weeds choking the vegetable garden and will them to wither and crumble to dust. She would guide a predator away from the chicken coop. It was her way of saying, "Thank you," a language they both understood. Days turned into a week. Jordan spent her time in the fields and the woods that bordered the property. She practiced. She learned to listen to the thoughts of a deer, not as words, but as a stream of instinct and sensation, fear, hunger, the warmth of the sun. She learned to still the frantic mind of a trapped rabbit, calming it until it ceased to struggle. She was not its master. She was its peace. One afternoon, a car, sleek and out of place, came bumping slowly down the lane. Jordan felt its approach long before she saw it. A spike of officialdom and unease. She retreated into the deepest shadows of the woods, becoming a part of the silence there. She watched as a man in a crisp shirt got out, holding a photograph. He knocked on the old woman's door. When she opened it, he showed her the picture. Jordan knew it was of her, the old her, the one with frightened eyes. The old woman squinted at it with her blind eyes. "Never seen her," she rasped. "Lots of kids run away. Don't none of them come out here." The man was persistent. "Are you sure? It's very important. Her family is worried." The woman was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "The only thing that comes out here is the wind, and it don't answer questions." She began to close the door. The man's frustration was a hot, red wave that Jordan could feel from the trees. He took a step forward, as if to block the door. "Ma'am, I really must insist." Jordan acted without thought. It was a reflex, like swatting a mosquito. She reached out with the pressure and touched his mind. She did not show him a false memory. She simply let him feel the profound, ancient emptiness of the land, the sheer, crushing weight of its indifference. She let him feel how small and temporary he was. A sudden, primal fear seized him. His face went pale. He stumbled back from the door, muttering an apology, and practically ran to his car, spinning his tires in the mud as he fled. The old woman stood in her doorway for a minute after he was gone, her head tilted as if listening. Then she turned, her milky eyes seeming to look directly at the spot where Jordan stood hidden. "The crows are in the corn again," she said, her voice carrying easily in the still air. Then she went back inside. Jordan smiled. It was not an invitation to stay forever. It was an acknowledgement that she was useful. It was a better welcome than any she had ever known. She was the quiet at the center of the storm, and for now she had found a center. The world was still out there, loud and demanding. But here, there was only the rustle of corn, the caw of a crow, and a simple, silent understanding between two women who asked for nothing from each other but the space to be. Story 3. The silver spoon in Cash's coffee trembled. It was a tiny thing, a vibration so minute it was felt more than seen. A hummingbird's heartbeat against the fragile bone china. He set the cup down on the saucer, the clink unnaturally loud in the morning stillness of the dining room. The spoon went still. He watched it for a full minute. The silence of Blackwater House pressing in, a physical weight against his eardrums. Outside the tall, grime-found windows, the main fog was a perpetual shroud, swallowing the pines and the rocky coastline whole. The house did not like clear days. It preferred to be swaddled in this damp, breathing gloom. He had come to Blackwater as a documentarian, a hired archivist for a family history that was, by all accounts, a slow-motion shipwreck. Bill, the last of the Blackwaters, had written to him with a script so elegant and despairing it felt like a relic itself. "The house has a memory," he'd written, "and it is forgetting us. Perhaps you can help us remember, before the final page is turned." It was a romantic notion, one that had appealed to Cash's academic sensibilities. He had imagined brittle letters and faded daguerreotypes, the gentle melancholy of a bygone era. He had not imagined the silence, a silence so profound it had a texture like velvet rot. Bill entered the room as he always did, a man moving through water. He was tall, or had been once, but a curvature of the spine had begun to claim him, pulling his shoulders forward in a perpetual state of apology or defense. His suit, though impeccably tailored from a finer time, hung on his gaunt frame. He did not look at Cash, but at the long mahogany table, its surface a dark, still lake reflecting the gloom. "The fog is thick this morning," Bill said, his voice a dry rustle. "It clings to the windows. Sometimes I think it is trying to get in. Or perhaps it is the house, breathing out." Cash nodded, unsure how to respond. He had been here for 3 weeks, and the rhythm of the place was seeping into him. The days were long, liquid stretches of time punctuated by the ticking of a dozen clocks, all out of sync, creating a dissonant chorus that frayed the nerves. He spent his hours in the library, a cavernous room where the air smelled of decaying leather and old, cold fires. The papers he was meant to catalog were a jumble of shipping manifests, personal diaries stained with wine or tears, and sketches of anatomical oddities that made his skin crawl. The Blackwater lineage was not one of statesmen and industrialists, but of natural philosophers, occultists, and collectors of the strange. They were a family that had peered too long into the abyss, and the abyss had peered obligingly back. The true heart of the house's unease, however, was Caitlin. Bill's sister was a wisp of a woman, a creature of shadows and sudden, silent appearances. Cash would look up from a ledger detailing the acquisition of a supposed mummy's hand from Cairo and find her standing in a library doorway, her pale eyes wide and unblinking, her form barely substantial enough to cast a shadow. She never spoke to him directly. Her conversations were for Bill alone, whispered confidences in corners that left her brother looking paler, more drained. One evening, Cash saw her in the grand hall, standing before the massive, tarnished mirror that hung between 2 skeletal suits of armor. She was not looking at her own reflection, but tracing the intricate, tarnished silver of the frame with a single bony finger. The frame was not decorated with leaves or flowers, but with a continuous, coiling pattern that, the longer Cash looked, resolved into a procession of contorted, agonized human figures, their mouths open in silent screams. "To history," a voice said beside him, making him jump. Bill had materialized from the darkness of an adjoining corridor. "The family history. We are a long line of the consumptive, the melancholic, the mad. The doctors have fancy new names for it now, of course. Genetic predisposition, neurochemical imbalance. My father called it the taint. A simpler, more honest word." "And what do you call it?" Cash asked. his eyes still locked on Caitlin's slow, deliberate tracing of the silver torment. Bill was silent for a long time. The only sound was the wet, rhythmic click of Caitlin's finger on the metal. "I call it the tenant," he said finally. "An old tenant in a house that is itself sick. The house and the family, you see, they are not two separate things. They are a single organism, dying together." Later that night, Cash was woken by a sound. It was not a scream, nor a crash, but a low, wet, rhythmic scraping. He followed it, his bare feet cold on the worn Persian runners, the sound leading him down to the kitchen, a vast, cavernous room of stone and dark wood. The door to the icebox, a monstrous, archaic appliance, was standing open. Caitlin was inside, her back to him. The scraping was the sound of a butcher's knife, sawing back and forth. She turned, her nightgown stained dark. In her hands was a large cut of meat, bloody and raw, but it was wrong. It was too pale, too marbled with strange bluish veins. It was not beef or pork. She looked at Cash, and for the first time, her eyes seemed to truly see him. They were not mad. They were ancient and terribly sad. "It's for the walls," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound that gets so hungry. "The medicine isn't enough." She turned back to her work, the scraping resuming. Cash backed away, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He did not sleep again that night. He sat in his room and watched the wallpaper, a pattern of faded lilacs that in the shifting moonlight seemed to writhe and pulse as if fed by some hidden vascular system. The days blurred into a single, protracted season of dread. The omens accumulated like dust. Cash found a dead songbird on his windowsill, its body perfectly intact but its bones, he discovered when he went to move it, crushed to a fine powder inside the skin. The clocks began to lose time, then gain it, their hands spinning wildly when no one was looking. He heard music sometimes, a thin, reedy melody from a music box that did not exist, a tune that felt like a memory of a fever dream. The air grew thick with the smell of turned earth and ozone, the scent of a storm that never broke. Bill's decline accelerated. He took to his bed, a massive four-poster that smelled of camphor and sickness. His skin became translucent, stretched tight over his skull. He spoke less and less, and when he did, it was not always in English. It was a guttural, clicking language that made the hairs on Cash's arms stand on end. Caitlin was his constant attendant, mopping his brow with a cloth that always came away stained a faint, phosphorescent green. One afternoon, Bill gripped Cash's wrist with a surprising, feverish strength. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated into black pools. "You think you are an observer," he hissed, his breath a foul wind from a deep cave. "You think you are separate, but the house reads you. It drinks your silence, feeds on your curiosity. You are another course in its long, long meal. It is learning you. When it is done, it will wear you." He fell back, exhausted. Cash pulled his hand away, his skin crawling. He fled the sick room and went to the library, seeking solace in the mundane task of sorting papers. But there was no solace. He found a sheaf of his own notes, the neat, precise handwriting he recognized as his own. But he had not written these pages. They were descriptions of his dreams, his private fears, his childhood memories of a dark closet he had been terrified of. They were written in his hand, down to the last idiosyncratic curl of his E.G. The house was not just reading him, it was copying him. The revelation came on a night when the fog was so thick, it seemed to be solid, pressing against the windows like a blind, patient face. The music box melody was louder than ever, seeming to emanate from the very walls. A terrible stillness had fallen over Blackwater House, the silence of a drawn breath. Cash knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that Bill was dead. He found Caitlin in the grand hall, standing before the great mirror. She was still, her hands clasped in front of her. The house around them seemed to be holding its breath. The clocks had all stopped. "He's gone," Cash said, his voice a stranger's in the crushing quiet. Caitlin did not turn. "He was the last anchor," she said, her voice flat, empty. "The last one who remembered what it was like before. Now there's only the memory of the house. And us. We have to leave, Caitlin. Now." At that, she turned. Her face was a mask of serene, untroubled peace. It was more terrifying than any expression of madness. "Leave? Where would we go? The house is in us, Cash. It's in our blood now. Bill's tenant. It needed a new home." A coldness, deep and absolute, spread through Cash's chest. He looked past her, at the monstrous mirror. The reflection showed the grand hall, the suits of armor, Caitlin's back, but it did not show him. Where he should have been standing, there was only a vague, man-shaped smudge of shadow, a darkness that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light like a dying star. He took a step forward, then another, drawn by a horror that was beyond screaming, beyond panic. He came to stand beside Caitlin, and together they faced the mirror. He watched as the smudge of shadow began to coalesce, to take on definition. It formed the outline of a man, his own height, his own build. The features swam into focus, sharp and clear. The tired eyes, the line of the jaw, the slight stoop of the shoulders from years spent hunched over books. He was looking at himself, but it was not a reflection. The Cash in the mirror was not mimicking his movements. He was standing perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his face a blank, placid slate. His eyes were open, but they held no recognition, no terror, no thought at all. They were the eyes of a doll, of a painted portrait. They were the eyes of the house. Cash waited for the scream to tear itself from his throat. He waited for the panic to seize his limbs, to send him fleeing into the devouring fog. But nothing came. The coldness in his chest had spread to his limbs, to his mind, a glacial calm. The frantic drum of his heart slowed, its rhythm shifting, sensing with the slow, deep, almost imperceptible pulse of the house itself. The fear did not vanish. It was simply absorbed, metabolized into the stillness. He looked at the mirror Cash. The mirror Cash looked through him. Cash's own hand rose, not of his own volition, but as a puppet's might, and came to rest on Caitlin's shoulder. Her hand came up and covered his, her skin cold as marble. There was no affection in the gesture. It was a ritual, an acknowledgement. He did not feel like a prisoner in his own skin. He felt like a tenant, finally settling into a long empty room. The thoughts in his head grew quiet, replaced by older, slower thoughts. The thoughts of the wood and the stone, the patient hunger of the foundations, the long, slow memory of the dust. He watched, from a great and untroubled distance, as the man he had been faded, like the last echo of a sound, in a vast, dark hall. In the mirror, the figure of Cash remained, a perfect, motionless statue. And in the grand hall of Blackwater House, Cash stood beside the last of the Blackwaters, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes open and unblinking, his breathing slowed to match the house's own. There was no terror. There was no reaction. There was only the stillness and the long, long wait. The silence was complete now, a finished thing. The faint, reedy music that had haunted the halls had stopped. Its purpose served. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic sigh of their breathing, his and Caitlin's. a duet synchronized with the subtle expansion and contraction of the house around them. He could feel it, a physical sensation, the floorboards under his feet swelling almost imperceptibly with each inhalation, the walls pressing gently outward. Caitlin turned from the mirror, her movement fluid and unnaturally quiet. Her eyes, those pale, knowing pools, passed over him without a flicker of emotion. She did not need to speak. A new understanding flowed between them, not through words, but through the shared substance of the house itself. It was a knowledge carried in the scent of damp plaster and rotting wood, transmitted through the worn threads of the carpet beneath their feet. She walked toward the main staircase, and he followed, his steps sure and soundless. He did not need to think about where to place his feet. The house guided him. They ascended together, the grand staircase groaning a familiar, comfortable complaint under their combined weight. The sound was not a protest, but a greeting. They did not go to Bill's room. That chapter was closed. The body already being attended to by processes Cash did not need to see to understand. Instead, they went to the library. The air in the room had changed. The smell of decay was still present, but it was no longer the decay of neglect. It was the rich, fecund smell of compost, of transformation. The papers on the desk, his own notes included, seemed to have settled, their frantic energy absorbed into the calm order of the place. Caitlin went to a high shelf, one he had needed a ladder to reach. She simply reached up, and her hand found a small, leather-bound book wedged behind a row of thicker volumes. She pulled it down and offered it to him. His fingers closed around the cover. The leather was cold and strangely supple, like skin. He opened it. The pages were filled with a tight, frantic script he did not recognize, but he could read it effortlessly. It was the journal of Alistair Blackwater, the great-grandfather, who had first become aware of the house consciousness. He spoke of it not as a haunting, but as a symbiosis, a marriage between bloodline and building. The family provided the anchor, the focal point of a will, and the house provided the memory, the permanence, the strength. The taint was not a sickness, but the sign of a successful grafting. He read for hours, or perhaps it was minutes. Time had become a different kind of substance, thick and slow-moving. He learned of the rituals, the small necessary offerings to keep the house sated, and the bond strong. The raw meat Caitlin prepared was not for the walls, not literally. It was a focus, a symbol of life and sustenance, its energy channeled through the intention of the act. The house fed on attention, on presence, on the quiet hum of a living soul within its structure. He looked up from the book. Caitlin was watching him, her head tilted. A thought, clear and foreign, formed in his mind. It is easier when you stop fighting. The house only wants to remember. He nodded. He understood now. His work was not over. It had just changed its nature. He was no longer the archivist of a dying family. He was the scribe for an immortal one. He picked up a pen from the desk, a heavy, silver-nibbed thing. He did not reach for a blank sheet of paper. He reached for the wall beside the desk, where the lilac-patterned wallpaper had peeled back slightly near the floor. He pressed the nib to the plaster. It accepted the ink without bleeding, the surface drinking it in. He began to write, not in his own hand, but in the same ornate, sprawling script as the journal. He wrote of the day Bill died. He wrote of the transfer, the acceptance. He wrote of the quiet that followed. The house sighed around him, a deep, contented shudder that ran from the foundations to the rafters. It was remembering, and he was its memory. The pen moved with a will that was not entirely his own, yet it felt more natural, more correct than any writing he had ever done. The words flowed onto the plaster, becoming not an inscription upon the house, but a part of its very flesh. When he finished, the script seemed to sink deeper into the wall, the lilacs of the wallpaper curling gently around the edges of the text as if to frame it. Caitlin made a small, approving sound in the back of her throat, a noise like dry leaves skittering across stone. From that moment, his old life became a poorly remembered dream. He no longer yearned for the sun, for the world beyond the ever-present fog. The fog was the house's breath, and it was a comfort. His needs became simple, dictated by the slow, deep rhythm of his new existence. He ate what Caitlin prepared, simple, flavorless foods that were less for sustenance and more for the ritual of the shared meal. He slept in short, fitful periods in his room, but he no longer dreamed his own dreams. Instead, he experienced flashes of the house, long memory, the feel of cold sea air from a century ago, the sound of a long-dead child's laughter, echoing in a now silent nursery, the taste of salt and regret from a Blackwater ancestor who had drowned his sorrows in brandy. His days were spent in a state of quiet communion. He would walk the halls, his fingers trailing over the banisters and door frames, feeling the subtle shifts in temperature, the almost imperceptible vibrations that were the house thoughts. Sometimes he would stop and write, using the silver nib to record these sensations directly onto the walls, the floors, even the ceiling in one dim corner of the ballroom. The house drank his words, and in return, it showed him things. He saw the foundation stones being laid, felt the ambition of the first Blackwater who had chosen this lonely cliff. He felt the weight of every death, every joy, every secret that had ever been held within these walls. They were all here, preserved not as ghosts, but as layers of memory, strata in the geology of the house consciousness. Caitlin was his guide, his sister in this new life. They rarely spoke aloud. They didn't need to. A glance could convey a day's worth of conversation. He understood now the source of her serenity. The frantic, fearful woman he had first seen was gone, because the part of her that had fought was gone. What remained was a perfect vessel, a calm, still pool reflecting the house's immense, ancient mind. One afternoon, he found himself standing before the great mirror in the hall. He did not flinch from his reflection now. The man who looked back was pale, his eyes deep-set and calm, his expression one of profound and untroubled knowledge. It was his face, but it was also the face of the house. He saw the patience of stone in his gaze, the resilience of aged wood in the set of his shoulders. He reached out and touched the glass. It was not cold, but warm, like living skin. The reflection did the same, and for a moment, the boundary between cache and the mirror cache, between the tenant and the home, dissolved completely. He was the house, and the house was him. He knew then that his work was not merely to record, but to maintain. The house was a living thing, and like all living things, it required care. He took up the knife Caitlin used and began to prepare the offerings himself, learning the precise cuts, the silent prayers that accompanied them. He would place the raw, strange meat in the icebox and feel the house's gratitude like a cool draft from the foundation. He would wind the clocks, not to tell the correct time, but to create the dissonant chorus that the house found pleasing, a sound that kept the outside world at bay. He was whole. He was home. The final page had not been turned after all. He had simply become part of the book, his story woven into the endless, elegant, despairing script of Blackwater House. And in the deep, velvet silence, he was finally, completely at peace. The first visitor came with a thaw, a distant relative bearing legal documents, and a face pinched with city concerns. Cash watched from an upstairs window as the man's car struggled up the muddy drive, a black beetle intruding on a world of gray. He felt the house stir, not with alarm, but with a low, thrumming interest. A new source of memory, a new story to absorb. Caitlin met the man at the door. Cash did not need to be present. He felt the conversation through the floorboards, the man's nervous, high-pitched voice, a vibration of irritation in the ancient wood. He offered condolences, spoke of probate, of assets and liquidation. Caitlin's responses were calm, simple denials. There was nothing to liquidate. The house was not an asset. It was a beneficiary. The man grew frustrated. His voice rose. Cash felt a corresponding tension in the walls, a subtle tightening, like a muscle flexing. He descended the stairs, not to intervene, but to observe. The man saw him and started, his eyes widening at Cash's pallor, his unnatural stillness. "You must be the archivist," the man said, attempting to regain composure. "Perhaps you can talk some sense into her. This place is a mausoleum. It needs to be sold." Cash looked at the man, through the man. He saw the frantic pulse in his throat, the shallow greed in his eyes, the thin, brittle shell of his modernity. He was ephemeral. He was noise. "The house is not for sale," Cash said, his voice a soft, dry rustle. It was the first time he had spoken aloud in weeks. "It's not her decision alone. There are procedures." The man took a step forward, a gesture of aggression. It was a mistake. The grand front door, of its own accord, swung shut with a soft, definitive thud. The sound was not loud, but it carried a finality that silenced the man mid-sentence. The light in the hall dimmed, the fog outside pressing closer against the windows, turning the glass opaque. The man turned, his face pale. He pulled at the door handle. It did not budge. Cash took a step closer. He could smell the man's fear now, a sharp, acrid scent that was not unpleasant to the house. It was a spice. "You should not have come," Cash whispered. "The house is particular about its guests." From the shadows near the staircase, Caitlin emerged. In her hands was a small porcelain plate. On it rested a single perfect oyster, glistening and raw. An offering, a welcome. "You look tired from your journey," she said, her voice as smooth and cold as the plate. "You should rest." The man stared at the oyster, then at Caitlin's placid face, then at Cash's hollow eyes. True terror dawned in him, the kind that erases all thought of money and law. He backed away, his shoulders hitting the solid, unyielding wood of the door. Cash picked up the oyster. The shell was cold and rough against his fingers. He held it out to the man. "It's for the walls," he said, echoing Caitlin's words from a lifetime ago. "They get so hungry." The man screamed then, a short, choked sound that was swiftly absorbed by the hungry silence of the hall. He did not take the oyster. He did not need to. The house had already tasted him. It had his scent, his fear, the pattern of his life. It would remember him. When the door finally creaked open of its own accord an hour later, the man fled without a backward glance, his car skidding down the drive as if pursued by wolves. Cash and Caitlin stood together in the open doorway, watching the taillights vanish into the fog. Cash felt a new memory settle into the fabric of the house, a story of intrusion, of rejection, of a morsel that got away. It was a good memory, a strong one. He turned and placed a hand on the door jamb, feeling the satisfied hum of the old wood. The house was secure. Their work continued. The long, long wait was punctuated not by dread, but by the quiet, patient business of eternity. The silence after the man's departure was richer, deeper. It tasted of his fear, a flavor that lingered in the air like a fine dust. Cash stood with Caitlin in the open doorway until the last echo of the car engine was swallowed by the fog. Then, as one, they turned and re-entered the hall. The door swung shut behind them, the lock clicking into place with a sound of finality. Cash did not return to the library. He was drawn instead to the dining room, to the long mahogany table scarred with the ghosts of 100 forgotten meals. He ran his fingers along the grain, feeling the whispers of conversations, of arguments, of toasts, raised with long-forgotten wine. The house was sated for now, but it was also thoughtful. The intrusion had been a reminder of the world outside, a world that was messy, loud, and persistent. A new understanding bloomed within him, not as a sudden thought, but as a slow, creeping certainty that rose from the floorboards. The house could not simply hide forever. The world would keep sending its emissaries, its lawyers and its relatives, each one a potential breach in their quiet eternity. Defensive measures were required, a more active discouragement. He found Caitlin in the kitchen, meticulously cleaning the porcelain plate that had held the oyster. She did not look up as he entered, but her stillness acknowledged him. He went to the icebox and opened it. The cold, metallic smell washed over him. He looked at the cuts of meat, pale and veined, resting on the chilled shelves. They were for the rituals, for the steady, gentle feeding that maintained the bond. But now he understood they could be for other things. He selected a different piece, not one of the neat packages, but a larger, rougher cut, dark and threaded with sinew. He placed it on the wooden counter. Caitlin paused her cleaning, her eyes shifting from the plate to the meat, then to his face. There was no question in her gaze, only a quiet assessment. He picked up the heavy cleaver, its handle worn smooth by generations of Blackwater hands. He did not bring it down with force. Instead, he pressed the blade against the dark flesh, not to sever, but to imprint. He closed his eyes and let the house guide his hand. He thought of the lawyer's face, his pinched, greedy features, the sharp scent of his terror. He channeled the house's disinterest, its ancient, territorial contempt for such transient things. When he lifted the cleaver, the meat was unmarked. But the feeling was there, seared into its essence. A warning, a repellent. "For the gate," he said, his voice a low murmur. Caitlin nodded. She took the meat from him, her fingers brushing his, a touch as cold and impersonal as the transfer of a tool. She carried it out of the kitchen and down the hall. Cash followed at a distance, feeling the house's attention focus on their progress. She did not go out the front door. She turned down a narrow servants' corridor he had rarely used, one that led to a small, rusted gate at the side of the property, nearly swallowed by thorny overgrowth. This was the weak point, the place where the outside world felt closest. She knelt, not on the damp ground, but on the stone path that was itself a part of the house foundation. She placed the meat at the base of the gate, tucking it between two stones like a secret. As she stood, a low wind stirred the fog, coiling through the thorns. It did not feel like a natural breeze. It felt like a breath being held. The house had accepted the new offering, this more active charm, this sentinel of disgust and dismissal. They returned to the main hall. The grand mirror showed their pale, placid forms, two pillars of a timeless order. Cash knew that the next visitor, if one was foolish enough to come, would not make it up the drive. They would feel a creeping, inexplicable revulsion. Their car would stall. They would see things in the fog that would turn their blood to ice. They would leave, and they would never return, their story adding another layer of fearful legend to the house's defenses. He was no longer just the scribe, the memory. He was the warden, and the house, pleased with this new, proactive aspect of its tenant, settled around him with a deep, resonant hum that was the closest it ever came to purring. The wait continued, but it was no longer passive. It was a watchful, guarded stillness, an eternity with teeth. The hum of the house became the backdrop of his days, a constant, low-frequency song that vibrated in his teeth and bones. He and Caitlin developed a new routine. Each morning, after the silent, ritualistic breakfast, they would walk the perimeter of the grounds, their progress slow and measured. They were not merely walking, they were reinforcing the boundary, their shared will reinforcing the house's own ancient wording. Cash would pause sometimes, kneeling to press his palm against the cold, damp earth. He could feel the tendrils of the house's consciousness extending deep into the soil, and he could feel the new active charm they had placed at the gate, a knot of cold, repelling energy that pulsed like a sick heart. One evening, as he transcribed the memory of a long-ago summer storm onto the paneling of the second-floor landing, he felt a subtle shift in the house mood. It was a quickening, a sense of focused attention that was different from its usual placid hunger. He set the pen down and went to the window. The fog was thinner than usual, and for a brief moment, it parted like a curtain. He saw the distant, glimmering lights of the town far below, nestled by the sea. They looked like embers, small and dying. He felt nothing for them. No longing, no connection. Only a distant, proprietary acknowledgement. They were part of the view, part of the house's domain, to be observed and, if necessary, ignored. Caitlin joined him at the window. She did not look at the lights, but at him. Her thought entered his mind, seamless and clear. It is good that you see. They are no part of us. He nodded. We are the anchor. We are the wall, she corrected gently. That night, he dreamed not the house memories, but a new kind of vision. He saw the cliff upon which Blackwater House stood, but from a great height, as if he were the moon looking down. He saw the house not as a building, but as a dark, intricate web of energy, its roots sunk deep into the rock, its influence a faint, shimmering stain spreading through the fog. And he saw other lights, other faint webs, scattered across the landscape. Some were bright and frantic, others were guttering and weak. He understood. They were other places of power, other old houses with their own symbiosis, their own tenants. They were distant, indifferent neighbors in a secret, silent world. He woke with the knowledge settled deep within him. His old quest for a singular grand revelation had been a child's fantasy. The truth was this quiet, perpetual work. The truth was the slow, inexorable expansion of their influence, the patient strengthening of their walls against the erosion of time and the intrusion of the ephemeral world. He went down to the kitchen. Caitlin was already there, waiting. On the table lay a dead crow, its feathers a sleek, iridescent black in the dim light. It was not mangled, but perfectly intact, as if it had simply chosen to die on their doorstep. An offering, but not from them, from the house itself. Cash picked it up. The body was light and stiff. He felt no revulsion, only a clinical appreciation for its form. He carried it to the icebox and placed it inside among the other, more conventional offerings. It was a new ingredient, a new tool. He did not know its purpose yet, but the house would tell him when the time was right. He closed the icebox door, the latch clicking shut with a sound like a satisfied whisper. The house was dreaming, and its dreams were becoming their own. There was no end to this, no final chapter. There was only the turning of the page, the adding of the word, the slow, sure knitting of their being into the eternal, patient dark. The crow remained in the icebox for 3 days. On the 4th morning, the house imparted its intention, not in words, but as a sudden, clear impulse that guided Cash's hands as he prepared the morning tea. He opened the icebox and removed the bird. Its feathers were now beaded with a fine frost, and its eyes were like chips of obsidian. Caitlin watched as he laid it on the counter. She brought him a small, sharp paring knife and a bowl of tarnished silver. The work was delicate. He did not pluck the bird, but instead, using the fine tip of the knife, he made a single, precise incision along its breastbone. With fingers grown unnaturally steady, he parted the skin and feathers, revealing the small, frozen architecture of its ribs. He worked the heart free, a tiny, dark stone of muscle. He placed it in the silver bowl. Then, with the same care, he removed the eyes. Caitlin took the bowl from him. She carried it to the grand fireplace in the main hall, where a low fire of driftwood and peat perpetually smoldered, its smoke carrying the scent of the sea and of deep, damp earth. She did not throw the contents into the flames. Instead, she held the bowl over the smoke, letting the thick, gray tendrils wash over the crow's heart and eyes, anointing them. Cash understood. This was not a feeding. This was the creation of eyes for the house. A way to see beyond the immediate grounds, to peer through the veil of its own fog. Later, they climbed together to the highest point of the house, a small, circular turret room that had once been an astronomer's study. The windows here were thick and bubbled with age. Caitlin placed the smoke-cured heart on the sill of the north-facing window. In the east-facing window, she placed one eye. Cash placed the other in the west. They did not speak. The ritual was complete. A new layer of perception settled over Cash. It was a subtle thing at first, like a second, far-reaching sense of touch. He could feel the weight of a storm gathering far out at sea, a pressure that was not yet air, but pure intention. He could feel the scurrying of small, burrowing creatures at the edge of the woods, their brief, frantic lives registering as tiny pinpricks of warmth against the cold soil. He could feel the slow, grinding patience of the cliff face as it endured the endless assault of the waves below. The house was stretching its senses, and through it, so were they. The world outside was no longer a mere threat or a distraction. It was a landscape to be monitored, a source of weather and potential disturbance. They were the custodians of this silence, and now their vigil extended beyond the walls, into the whispering woods and the moody sea. Their peace was not a fragile thing to be protected. It was a force, and it was growing. Story 4. The wind began it, a low threnody through the high pines that surrounded the house where I grew up. It was not a violent wind, but a persistent one. A breath that seemed to shape itself around the contours of the old Victorian, slipping under the eaves and through the cracks in the window frames I had once helped my father caulk. It carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, the cold, clean perfume of a Maine autumn. But beneath that, something else. A faint, coppery tang, like a penny held on the tongue. I stood on the gravel path, my suitcase a dead weight in my hand, and listened. Sound was a whisper, a secret the trees had kept for a long time, and were only now, reluctantly, beginning to tell. The house itself was just as I remembered, a grand gingerbread-trimmed lady, painted a cheerful, now faded yellow. My mother, Danielle, had always insisted on the color. She said it was like captured sunshine, but now, standing before it, the analogy felt wrong. It was the yellow of old bone, of parchment left too long in the light. The windows were dark eyes, and the wraparound porch seemed less an invitation and more a baring of teeth. I shook the feeling off. It was just a house. It was just the wind. The door opened before I could raise my hand to knock. My mother stood there, backlit by the dim hall light. She was smaller than I remembered. The vibrant, loud woman of my childhood reduced, folded in on herself. Her hair, once a riot of dark curls, was a sleek, silver cap, too neat, too still. She smiled, but it was a slow, deliberate motion, as if she had to remember how the muscles worked. "Carla," she said, and her voice was a whisper, rustling like dry leaves. "You're here?" She did not move to hug me. She simply stood aside, a silent invitation to enter the throat of the house. The air inside was still and heavy, smelling of lemon polish and dust, and beneath it, that same metallic hint I had caught on the wind. It was cold, a deep, settled chill, that the central heating, rattling somewhere in the bowels of the house, could not hope to touch. "How are you, Mom?" I asked, setting my bag down on the Persian rug whose patterns I had traced with my small fingers a lifetime ago. "I'm fine, dear, just fine." She drifted toward the kitchen, her movements fluid and soundless. I'll make tea. I followed her, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood, a clumsy intrusion compared to her ghostly glide. The kitchen was obsessively clean, every surface gleaming, the canisters aligned with a military precision my chaotic mother had never possessed. A single, sharp knife lay on the cutting board, its blade catching the light. She filled the kettle, her back to me, and as she did, I saw them. On the pale skin of her wrist, just peeking from the cuff of her cardigan, were faint gray lines. They were not scratches. They were marks, deliberate and intricate, like the first strokes of a charcoal drawing. A symbol I did not recognize. "What's on your arm?" I asked, my voice too loud in the quiet. She turned, her expression placid, and tugged the sleeve down. "Nothing, dear. Just an itch." The dry air. She turned back to the stove, and the moment was sealed shut. The kettle began its low gathering whine, a sound that climbed the scale of my nerves. That night, I lay in my old bedroom, the one with the floral wallpaper and the window that looked out over the back garden. The wind had not relented. It spoke in tongues against the glass. I tried to sleep, but the house was not silent. It creaked and settled, and in those sounds, I began to hear patterns. A soft, shuffling step in the hall outside my door. A low, rhythmic scraping, like a chair being dragged slowly across the floor above. My mother's room was on the first floor. The second floor had been closed off for years. I told myself it was the plumbing, the old bones of the house groaning in the cold. I pulled the quilt up to my chin, the fabric smelling faintly of cedar and thyme, and I focused on the memory of my mother as she was, laughing in this very garden, her hands covered in soil, her voice a bright, clear bell as she called me in for supper. The memory was warm and solid, a rock to cling to in the shifting dark. But the cold seeped in anyway, and the scraping from above did not stop. The days that followed had a strange, dual quality. In the daylight, things were almost normal. Almost. My mother would move through her routines, dusting, preparing small, bland meals, sitting for hours in the parlor with a book in her lap that she never seemed to turn the page of. Her conversation was a series of pleasantries, a smooth, polished surface with no depth. She never spoke of my father, who had died when I was 12. She never asked about my life in the city, my job, my friends. It was as if the past and the future had been neatly excised, leaving only this thin, endless present. But the signs were there, for anyone who knew how to look. The symbols. I found them scratched into the baseboard in the dining room, carved into the soft wood of the windowsill in the pantry, drawn in a fine layer of dust on the mantelpiece. They were angular, alien things, composed of intersecting lines and spirals that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. They felt old, older than the house itself. I tried to ask her about them again one afternoon as we sat with our tea. "Mom, those marks, I've seen them in a few places. What are they?" She looked at me, her head tilted, her eyes a calm, placid blue. They were the eyes of a doll. "Marks? I don't see any marks, Carla. You always did have such an imagination." She took a sip of her tea, her hand perfectly steady. Just the house settling, making patterns in the dust. The reassurance was smooth as glass, and just as cold. It was a lid being pressed down on a boiling pot. I let it go, the unspoken words turning to stone in my gut. The true break in the facade came during a trip into town for groceries. I was at the general store, the one that still had a wooden floor and sold everything from nails to licorice, when I ran into Mrs. Higgins from down the road. She was a woman who had known me since I was in diapers, whose face was a road map of wrinkles and kindness. But when she saw me, her smile faltered. "Carla," she said, clutching her basket tighter. "I heard you were back. How is Danielle?" "She's okay," I said, the lie automatic. "Quiet." Mrs. Higgins nodded. her eyes darting past me, toward the road that led to our house. She keeps to herself these days, has for a while now. She leaned in closer, and I caught the scent of lavender and anxiety. "You be careful up there, dear." "Careful of what?" She shook her head, a quick, nervous motion. "The house. It's always had a different feel. Even when your father was alive, he knew it. Your mother. She's let it in." She touched my arm, her fingers cold. "She talks to the walls, Carla. I've seen her through the window in the evening, just sitting in the dark, talking to the walls." A shiver, cold and sharp, traced its way down my spine. Who is she talking to? But Mrs. Higgins just pulled her hand back as if burned. It's not a who. It's the silence. She's filling the silence with something that was already there. She turned and hurried away, leaving me alone in the aisle, the cheerful jingle of the doorbell mockery. That night, the tension broke. I awoke to a sound that was not the wind, not the house settling. It was a voice. My mother's voice, but stripped of its flat, effectless tone. It was layered, resonant, a chorus of whispers speaking in unison. It came from downstairs. I crept out of bed, the floorboards like ice under my bare feet. I moved to the top of the stairs and looked down into the living room. The room was dark, lit only by the embers in the fireplace. My mother was on her knees before the hearth, her back to me. She was naked. Her skin, in the dull red glow, was a canvas of those same gray symbols, now covering her from her neck down to her ankles. They swirled and pulsed, as if drawn in something alive, and she was chanting. The words were guttural, ancient, a language that had no business in this world. They were not words of supplication, but of invitation, of welcoming. The air in the room grew thick, humming with a low, sub-audible frequency that vibrated in my teeth. The shadows in the corners of the room began to detach themselves, pooling and flowing like ink, converging on her kneeling form. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper. The chanting stopped. Her head rotated on her neck, a smooth, impossible turn. Her eyes were no longer placid blue. They were black, depthless, reflecting the dying fire like distant, dying stars. She smiled, a wide, terrible stretching of the lips that showed too many teeth. "It's hungry, Carla," the chorus of voices said from her throat. "It's been waiting for you. A daughter of the line. It prefers us." I ran. I do not remember the act of running, only the sensation of cold air and terror, of stumbling through the dark house, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I slammed the door to the basement, the one place I had avoided, the place my father had always kept locked. I fumbled for the light switch, my breath sobbing in my throat. The single bare bulb flickered on, illuminating the cavernous space. It was not a basement of boxes and forgotten furniture. The stone walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in the same symbols that adorned my mother's skin. They were carved deep, painted in something dark and flaky that I knew, with a primal certainty, was old blood. In the center of the room was a large, flat stone, like an altar, stained with the same substance, and arranged around it, neatly, almost reverently, were a collection of small, yellowed bones. Animal bones, I told myself, even as my eyes identified the delicate curve of a human rib, the small, perfect dome of a child's skull. This was the silence Mrs. Higgins had spoken of. This was what had been waiting in the bones of the house, in the land itself. It wasn't a ghost. It was a presence, an ancestral force, a patient, hungry thing that had been woven into the foundation of our home, into the bloodline of our family. My mother hadn't just let it in. She had become its vessel. A soft footfall on the top step. Then another. She was coming down. I backed into the farthest corner, behind a furnace, my body shaking uncontrollably. The light bulb swayed, casting dancing, monstrous shadows. The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath, pluming in the dim light. The coppery smell was overwhelming here, a thick, cloying perfume of old death. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there, still naked, her body a living manuscript of the thing that owned her. The black eyes found me in my hiding place. "There is no leaving," the voices whispered, a sound like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. "The house is awake. It has tasted our blood for generations. Your father tried to break the chain. He built walls. He painted it yellow. He tried to fill it with light and noise. But the silence was always louder. But she took a step toward me. The shadows in the room thickened, pressing in. It wants a new voice, a younger throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end, for the cold touch, for the final screaming silence. But it did not come. When I opened my eyes, he was simply standing there watching me. The terrible smile was gone. The blackness in her eyes had receded, leaving only a faint gray film over the blue, like a morning fog. For a single heart-stopping moment, it was my mother looking out at me. Her face was a mask of utter, desolate horror. A single tear traced a clean path through the gray filth on her cheek. "The well," she breathed, her voice her own, a thin, frayed thread of sound. "It sleeps in the old well." Then the presence slammed back into her. Her body stiffened, her head jerked, and the blackness flooded her eyes once more. She turned away from me and walked slowly, deliberately, back up the stairs. The door at the top clicked shut. I heard the turn of the lock. I have been down here for a long time. The light bulb burned out hours ago. The darkness is absolute, of physical weight. It is not an empty darkness. It is a listening darkness. I can feel it breathing, a slow, tidal rhythm that is not my own. I can feel the cold stone of the altar against my back. And I can feel the presence in the house above me, moving through the rooms with my mother's feet. It is patient. It knows I have nowhere to go. The symbols on the walls, I can feel them, and even though I cannot see them, their patterns etched onto the back of my eyelids. They are not just marks. They are a language. They are a story. And I am the last sentence. Sometimes, in the perfect quiet, I think I can hear the wind again. A faint, faraway sigh. But it is not the wind. It is the sound of the well, out in the garden, breathing. And I find myself in the absolute black, beginning to whisper the words my mother chanted. The sounds feel familiar in my mouth, like a song I learned in a dream. They are a key, and I am so very cold. The words left my lips, not as a conscious decision, but as an exhalation, a final surrender to the cold that had taken root in my bones. They were unfamiliar syllables, guttural and sharp, yet they fit together in my mouth with a dreadful, practiced ease. As I whispered into the pressing black, the air in the basement changed. The heavy, listening silence began to vibrate, a low hum that resonated in the hollow of my chest. Above me, the floorboards creaked, not the random settling of an old house, but a deliberate, weighted step. Then, another. They moved across the ceiling, pausing directly over my head. A new sound joined the hum, a slow, wet dragging, like a heavy sack being pulled across the floor. It moved toward the kitchen, toward the back door. The lock on the basement door clicked. I did not move. The choice to stay or go felt irrelevant. The thing in the house, the presence that wore my mother, was hurting me. The open door was not an escape. It was the next page of the story. I stood, my legs stiff and numb, and climbed the stairs on trembling limbs. The kitchen was empty. The back door stood open, a rectangle of profound darkness, for the moon was shrouded by thick cloud. The coppery scent was stronger here, mixed with the rich, rotting smell of the wet garden. From the open doorway, I could see it. The old stone well, a forgotten relic at the far end of the property, half swallowed by untended rose bushes and ivy. My father had capped it with a heavy wooden lid when I was a child. That lid was now gone, and my mother was there. She stood with her back to me, perfectly still, a pale statue in the gloom, facing the dark maw of the well. The dragging sound was clearer now, and I saw its source. A thick, viscous substance, black in the scant light, seeped from the well's opening. It oozed over the mossy stones, not like water, but like syrup, pulling itself in a slow, living tide across the grass. It left a glistening, iridescent trail, and as it moved, the whispers began. Not from my mother, but from the well itself, a soft, multitudinous murmur. That was the true voice of the wind in the pines, the true sound of the house's settling bones. My mother turned. Her face was serene, the horror I had glimpsed completely erased. The symbols on her skin seemed to pulse with a faint, internal luminescence. She did not speak, but raised a hand, her finger pointing first at me, then down into the well. The black substance reached my bare feet. It was not cold, but unnervingly warm, like blood fresh from a vein. It clung to my skin, a gentle, insistent pressure. And with the touch came the memories. Not my memories, their memories. Cascade of faces. Women of my line, my grandmother, her mother, generations back, all standing where I stood. Their fear, their resignation, their terrible, twisted love for the thing that had chosen them. I saw my father, not as the cheerful man of my childhood, but as a hollowed-out shell, painting the house a frantic, desperate yellow, nailing boards over windows, trying to keep out what was already inside. He had not died of a sudden illness. He had been spent, used up. The understanding did not come as a shock, but as a grim, final acceptance. This was my inheritance. This was the family business. The presence was not a demon to be exorcised. It was the soil, the trees, the very air. It was the land itself, and we were its caretakers, its voice, its sustenance. The whispering from the well grew louder, more insistent. It was a lullaby. It was a summons. I took a step forward. The warm black ooze welcomed me, pulling me gently toward the well. My mother watched, her black eyes shining with a perverse pride. I was not being consumed. I was being joined. I reached the stone rim and looked down. There was no water, no reflection. There was only a deeper darkness, a vortex of silent, hungry history. The warmth at my feet became an invitation, a promise of an end to the cold, an end to the loneliness. I placed my hands on the cold, wet stone. The whispers became a single clear voice in my mind. My voice. It was time to come home. I swung my leg over the edge. The stone was rough and slick against my palms. The darkness below was not empty. It was a presence, a patient, open mouth. The warmth from the ooze climbed my legs, a soothing balm after the basement's chill. It promised an end to the fear, an end to the struggle. It promised I would never be alone again. My mother's chanting began once more, a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate up from the earth through the soles of my feet. The symbols on her skin glowed brighter, casting a sickly, phosphorescent light on the well's rim. The black substance pulsed in time with her words, each throb pulling me gently inward. I looked at her face one last time. It was not a face of malice, but of completion. She had finished her work. She had brought the next vessel to the source. A final rebellious spark flickered within me. A memory of my father, not of his despair, but of his laughter, booming through the kitchen. A memory of my mother, the real one, planting marigolds. Her smile genuine and bright. It was a tiny, fragile thing, that spark, but it was enough to make me hesitate. The reaction was instantaneous. The gentle pull became a violent yank. The warm ooze turned searing hot, gripping my ankles like manacles. The whispering voice in my mind sharpened into a shriek of fury. My mother's chanting rose to a crescendo, the chorus of voices tearing from her throat. The stone beneath my hands shifted. Not the whole well, but a single loose rock near the edge. My father, in his frantic attempts to seal it, must have missed one. Without thought, my fingers clawed at it, prizing it from its bed of mortar and moss. It was heavy, a jagged piece of granite the size of my fist. The thing that was my mother lunged, her movements unnaturally swift, her hands reaching for me with fingers bent like claws. I did not swing the rock at her. I turned, and with all the strength I had left, hurled it into the heart of the well. There was no splash, only a profound, resonant crack, as if I had struck a solid surface deep in the earth. Then, silence. The chanting stopped. The pulling ceased. The black ooze lost its warmth and its grip, sloughing off my skin like cold mud. The luminescent symbols on my mother's body flickered and died. She stood frozen, her arms still outstretched, her black eyes wide with what looked like shock. From the depths of the well came a new sound, a low, grating rumble, the sound of stone grinding against stone. Then, a sigh. It was a sound of immense, weary disappointment. It was the sound of the house itself, deflating. The presence was receding. I could feel it pulling back, withdrawing from the air, from the stones, from my mother. She gasped, a ragged, human sound. The blackness drained from her eyes, leaving them a confused, frightened blue. She looked at her naked, symbol-scarred body, at the well, at me, perched on its edge. Her face crumpled. A wail of pure, unadulterated grief tore from her lips, a sound more terrible than any chorus of whispers. She collapsed onto the wet grass, sobbing. I climbed down from the well, my body trembling with exhaustion and shock. The garden was just a garden again, dark and cold. The house was just a house, silent save for my mother's weeping. The lock was broken. The story was not over, I knew. It could never be over. But the sentence had been changed. I went to my mother, pulling my own thin nightgown around me, and knelt beside her in the damp. I did not know if I could ever touch her again, but I stayed there, in the dark, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, waiting for a morning I never thought I would see. And then, the morning light did not bring warmth. It was a pale, washed-out gray that exposed the garden in all its neglected detail. The rose bushes were thorny tangles, the grass was choked with weeds, and the black ooze from the well had hardened into a brittle, flaky crust that crunched underfoot. My mother's sobs had subsided into shallow, hitching breaths. She sat curled into herself, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. I found an old raincoat hanging on a hook by the back door and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at my touch, but did not pull away. Her skin was icy. I helped her to her feet. She was light, hollowed out. We did not speak as I led her back into the kitchen. The house felt different. Not safe. Never safe. But dormant. The oppressive weight of being watched was gone, replaced by a profound emptiness, like a tomb after the soul has departed. I sat her at the kitchen table and put the kettle on. The mundane act felt absurd, a play from a life that no longer existed. She watched the steam rise from the spout, her eyes red-rimmed and lost. "Danielle," I said, my voice rough from disuse. She blinked slowly, as if remembering her own name. "It's gone quiet," she whispered. For so long, it was all I could hear. A song. A beautiful, terrible song. And now, it's quiet. She looked at me, her gaze finally focusing. "What did you do, Carla?" "I threw a rock," I said, the simplicity of it sounding foolish. She shook her head, a faint, weary motion. "No, you refused it. No one has ever refused it." A tear traced a new path through the grime on her cheek. "Your father tried to wall it out. He fought it. But in the end, he just gave up. He let it take him. It was easier." The kettle whistled, a shrill, normal sound that made us both jump. I made the tea, my hands shaking so badly I sloshed hot water onto the counter. As I set a mug in front of her, I saw her eyes drift past me, toward the basement door. The horror was returning to her face, the memory of what she had been, what she had done, settling in. "The bones," she said, her voice trembling. "In the basement, they were offerings, to keep it satisfied, to keep it from taking us completely." She looked at her hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "It preferred the young, but it would take what it was given." A cold nausea rose in my throat. I thought of the small, delicate skull. I thought of my father's sudden illness. He hadn't been spent. He had been given. We drank our tea in silence. The house creaked around us, but it was just the wind now, just the old wood. The silence was no longer a living thing. It was just an absence. And in that absence, the reality of what we had to do began to take shape. We could not stay here. We could not call the police. How would we explain the carvings, the altar, the small, yellowed bones? We were the caretakers of this horror. We were the only ones who could clean it up. My mother's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw the same grim resolve there. The thing that had bound us together in its service was gone, but it had left a new, darker bond in its place. A shared secret, a shared guilt. "We need shovels," she said, her voice flat. "And a lime." I nodded. The morning was still young, but the sky promised only more gray. We had work to do. The well was waiting, not as a gateway anymore, but as a grave, and we were the only ones left to fill it. We worked through the day. The physical labor was a blessing, a brutal distraction from the thoughts screaming in our heads. The lime bit into our lungs and the dirt clung to our sweat-slicked skin. We did not speak of what we were burying. We just dug side by side, a mother and daughter digging a hole to the center of their own history. The well accepted everything we gave it. The bones from the basement, the stained altar stone, the raincoat stained with black flakes. We poured bag after bag of lime on top, a desperate attempt to purify what could not be cleansed. When it was full, we covered it with soil, then with the heavy wooden lid my father had made. It felt like placing a headstone. We burned the rugs from the living room and my mother's bedroom in a pit behind the shed. The symbols in the wood of the house remained, but we scrubbed the walls until the paint peeled, trying to erase the memory of their shape. We were not cleaning a house. We were sanitizing a crime scene. 2 days later, we left. We packed a single suitcase each and got into the car. My mother did not look back as we drove down the long, winding driveway. I did. The yellow house stood silent against the pines, looking for all the world like just a house. But I knew the truth. It was a lid on a box, and we were the ones who had closed it. We drove south for 2 days, finally stopping in a dusty motel in a town where no one knew our names. We paid in cash. We slept with the lights on. We are trying to learn how to be people again. My mother jumps at every sound. Sometimes I catch her tracing patterns on her own arm, her fingers moving in a ghost of the old rituals, and her eyes go distant with a longing that terrifies me. The quiet is not peaceful. It is the quiet of a missing limb. The thing is gone, but the space it occupied inside us remains, a hollowed-out cavity. We do not talk about the future. We exist in the stark, simple present of cheap motel rooms and highway diners. We are bound together not by love, but by the awful unspoken truth of what we are. We are the last of our line. We are the ones who got away. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up certain that I can still hear it, not in the wind, but in the silence between my own heartbeats. A faint, patient whisper calling its children home. The diner coffee is bitter and thin. I watch my mother stir 3 packets of sugar into hers, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she's performing a delicate task. She hasn't spoken since we left the motel this morning. Her silence is a wall I don't know how to breach. The waitress refills our cups, her smile a bright, meaningless gesture in the heavy air between us. My mother flinches when the woman's arm brushes her shoulder. "We need money," I say, the words sounding too loud. She doesn't look up. I know. The money we took from my father's old lockbox won't last forever. It feels tainted, like everything else from that house. I think of getting a job, of standing behind a counter and making small talk, and the idea is so absurd I almost laugh. How could I explain the gaps in my life? What reference could my mother give? She finally lifts her head, her eyes finding mine. The blue is clearer today, but the shadows under them are deep and permanent. It's not finished, Carla. A cold trickle runs down my spine. We buried it. We burned it. We buried the bones. We burned the rags. She says it with a terrible patience. We did not bury the story. The story is waiting for another teller. She looks out the window at the flat, sun-bleached landscape. It is so different from the deep woods and the yellow house, but I know what she means. The absence of the thing is a story in itself. Our running is a story. The symbols are still on the walls of the house, waiting for the next family by the property, for some curious child to find them and start asking questions. The well is covered, but it is not gone. It is a sleeping seed. What do we do? I ask, and I hate the childish need in my voice. She turns her coffee cup in its saucer. A slow, endless rotation. We remember. We are the record now. As long as we remember what it is, as long as we resist the song, it stays in the ground. She looks at me, and for a fleeting moment, I see the fierce, protective woman she might have been before the whispers took root. We have to be stronger than the quiet. The quiet is when it calls the loudest. We pay the bill and walk back to the car. The sun is high and hot, but I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. She is right. Our flight was not an escape. It was a strategic retreat. We are not survivors on a vacation. We are sentinels, posted far from the front line, but standing watch nonetheless. I start the car and pulled back onto the endless highway. We are not driving toward anything. We are just moving, keeping the story contained within the shell of this car, a secret between a mother and a daughter, a prayer against the coming dark. The car became our world, a metal shell hurtling through a landscape that held no meaning. We drove through deserts where the heat shimmered on the asphalt like a mirage, and through towns that were just a blur of gas stations and fast food signs. We never stayed in the same motel twice. We paid cash and used false names, a practice my mother insisted upon with a quiet, unnerving certainty. She had a new purpose now, a vigilance that had replaced her despair. She watched people, her eyes cataloging every glance, every stray word from a waitress or a gas station attendant, searching for a sign that we were being followed. Not by men, but by the story itself. One night, in a motel room that smelled of bleach and mildew. I woke to the sound of her scratching. She was sitting on the floor by her bed, a ballpoint pen in her hand, and she was drawing on the motel notepad. The lines were frantic, chaotic, but I could see the beginnings of the familiar, twisting patterns. I said her name sharply. She started, looked at the pad as if seeing it for the first time, and then tore the sheet into tiny, confetti-like pieces, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's just the quiet," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "It's just the quiet trying to get in." We crossed a state line the next day, and she made me stop at a library in a small, dusty town. She disappeared into the stacks and emerged an hour later, her face pale but set. In the car, she showed me a book on local folklore. There was a chapter on families, old families who had lived in isolated areas, who were rumored to have pacts with the land. The descriptions were vague, sanitime and repetition, but the underlying structure was the same. A presence, a lineage of caretakers, a hunger. We were not unique. We were just a single, sick branch on a tree whose roots went deep and wide. "This is how it finds new tellers," my mother said, her voice low and urgent. "The stories are its spores. They drift on the wind until they find fertile ground." She closed the book with a definitive thud. "We can't just remember. We have to find the other branches. We have to warn them." The idea was so vast, so terrifying, that I could only stare at her. We were two broken women in a beat-up car running from our own shadows. How could we possibly hunt for others like us? But the alternative was to keep running forever, until the money ran out or our nerve broke, until the quiet finally won. I looked at my mother's hands, clenched tight on the book. She was not the woman from the well anymore. She was something else, something forged in the aftermath. A hunter of the story that had made her its prey. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the library parking lot. The road ahead was straight and empty, leading to a horizon I could not see. We were not just sentinels anymore. We had become seekers, and the map we were following was written in whispers and in blood. The seeking began with a name, Alistair Prolux. He was mentioned in the book's bibliography, an academic who had compiled regional accounts of geological anomalies and familial folk tales. My mother held onto that name like a lifeline. It was a thread, however thin, leading out of the labyrinth of our own nightmare. We found a payphone outside a laundromat. The receiver was sticky and the cord was frayed, but it felt safer than using a motel phone. My mother's voice was steady as she asked the university switchboard for the anthropology department. She inquired after Professor Prolux, her tone that of a respectful, if slightly scattered, graduate student. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "Professor Prolux passed away last year. A sudden illness. Nandoane. Tanai. Banda." The words landed like stones in the pit of my stomach. A sudden illness. I saw my father, pale and gaunt, in his bed. My mother's knuckles were white where she gripped the phone. "I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." She hung up and leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the phone booth. The hope that had briefly animated her seemed to drain away, leaving her hollow once more. "It knows we're looking," she murmured. "Or it's just a coincidence," I said, the argument sounding weak even to me. She turned to me, her eyes haunted. "There are no coincidences, only patterns we're too slow to see." She pushed open the door of the booth. He had a family, a wife. Maybe they have his papers. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. Going to the home of a dead man connected to our curse felt like walking directly into a spider's web. But the inertia of driving was no longer enough. We needed a direction. We drove for 2 more days, the map on the passenger seat now marked with a circle around a small college town. The Prolux house was on a quiet, tree-lined street, a neat Victorian with a wide porch. It looked normal, safe, the kind of house we had once lived in before. My mother sat in the car for a long time, just watching the house. "You should stay here," she said finally. "No," I said. The word was out before I could think. I would not let her face this alone again. We walked up the path together. A woman answered the door on the second ring. She was perhaps 60, with kind eyes and a face lined with a grief that was still fresh. She looked at us, two strangers in travel-worn clothes, with polite curiosity. "Mrs. Prue?" my mother asked, her voice soft. "My name is Danielle. This is my daughter, Carla. We were admirers of your husband's work. We were hoping perhaps we could speak with you for a moment." The woman's smile was sad. "Alistair's work," she said, almost to herself. She stepped back, inviting us in. The house was full of books and the faint, sweet smell of baking. It was so normal it felt like a dream. We sat in the living room. My mother did not waste time with elaborate lies. She spoke in a low, earnest voice, carefully omitting the worst of it, talking only of family traditions and unusual occurrences that matched some of her husband's research. She mentioned the yellow house, not by location, but by description. The well, the symbols. Mrs. Proax listened, her hands folded in her lap. As my mother spoke, the polite curiosity on her face slowly melted away, replaced by a deep, unsettling recognition. When my mother finished, the room was silent save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Mrs. Proax stood up and walked to a writing desk in the corner. She unlocked a drawer and pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal. She brought it back and placed it on the coffee table between us. "Alistair didn't die of an illness," she said, her voice steady but filled with a profound sorrow. "He took his own life. He'd been working on a new book. He called it The Geology of Silence. He said he was getting close to the source. In his last note, he told me to burn this journal if anyone ever came asking about his work." She looked from my mother to me, her gaze clear and direct. "But he also said you would come. He said the daughters of the silence always find each other, eventually."